Hey guys, tonight we journey back to meet the most famous monsters in history, only to discover they're not what we've been told they are at all. Imagine you are standing in a humid Cretaceous forest. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting ferns. Before you, a mountain of muscle and teeth, the Tyrannosaurus rex of your nightmares. Its skin is thick, leathery, covered in reptilian scales that glisten in the dappled sunlight. You can feel the ground shake with its every step. This is the image we've all grown up with, cemented in our minds by movies and museum halls. But look closer. What if the most crucial detail of this creature, the very thing that defined its lineage, is completely wrong? What if the truth is fluttering right outside your window right now? For over a century, these titans were locked in our minds as scaly dead ends, evolutionary failures. But then, a strange fossil from a German quarry, followed by a landslide of impossible discoveries from a place that would become known as the Dragon's Nursery, began to tell a different story. A story of fuzz, color, and feathers. So where did birds really come from? Were the terrible lizards of our imagination actually giant, fluffy predators? And how did a revolution in science completely repaint our picture of the ancient world? Thanks to an avalanche of new fossils and incredible technology that can see the colors of a lost world, tonight we are going to unravel the mystery of the feathered dragons. Frankly, if you were actually standing in front of a real T-Rex, scaly or fluffy, you'd be less concerned with its fashion choices and more with becoming a prehistoric snack. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That small click sends a big signal to the algorithm. That long-form, serious educational content still matters. And to me, it's an incredibly meaningful show of support. Thank you so much for helping keep this channel going strong. It always fascinates me to see where you're all tuning in from. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You can almost feel the weight of that classic image, can't you? The giant, scaly beasts of our collective imagination. They lumber through a primordial swamp, all grey and green leather, their tails dragging on the ground. This vision was shaped for us over 100 years ago by pioneering artists and later immortalized by cinema. It's a powerful picture, but it's a picture built on incomplete information, a first draft of a much stranger story. For the longest time, the Book of Life had a huge, glaring, blank chapter. On one page, you have the dinosaurs, reigning supreme for over 150 million years. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, you have birds, complex, warm-blooded, intelligent creatures that dominate the skies. How did you get from one to the other? For decades, the simple answer was, you don't. They were seen as two completely different stories. The very name we use for them biased our perspective from the start. In 1842, the brilliant but notoriously curmudgeonly British anatomist Sir Richard Owen examined a few large fossil bones from across England. He realized they belonged to a unique group of extinct reptiles, and he coined the term dinosauria, which translates to terrible lizard. The name stuck, and with it, the unshakable image of a purely reptilian dynasty. Dinosaurs were lizards, just bigger and more terrible. But then, just 2 years after Darwin published On the Origin of Species, a discovery was made that should have changed everything. In a limestone quarry in Bavaria, Germany, workers splitting stone found something impossible. There, on a slab of pale rock, was the fossil of a creature about the size of a crow. It had a lizard-like tail and a jaw full of tiny, sharp teeth, but exquisitely preserved in the stone around its bones was a perfect, unmistakable halo of feathers. This was Archaeopteryx, the first clue, a creature that seemed to defy classification, a glitch in the tidy categories of life. The find came from the Solnhofen limestone, a geological formation famous for its incredibly fine grain. It's so perfect, in fact, that it was the material of choice for the process of lithography, or printing from stone. It's a wonderful bit of irony. The very stone used as a medium to mass-produce images was preserving the one fossil image that would eventually force us to redraw all the others. Immediately, the scientific world erupted. Scholars were deeply divided on whether this creature was a true ancestral bird, a bizarre reptilian sideshow, or something else entirely. It was a heated argument that would simmer for over a century. The physical evidence on the slab was bafflingly contradictory. You could look at it and see a bird. The feathers weren't just simple fuzz. They were complex, with a central shaft and veins clearly designed for flight. But then you'd look at the skeleton and see a dinosaur. The hands had 3 separate fingers ending in sharp claws. The jaw wasn't a beak, but a snout full of teeth. And trailing behind it was a long, bony tail, vertebra by vertebra, just like that of any small predatory reptile. It wasn't half bird, half reptile. It was somehow impossibly both at the exact same time. It was the first feathered dragon. You are no longer in that Cretaceous forest. The air has changed. It's now salty and warm, carrying the scent of a shallow tropical sea. You're standing on an island in the late Jurassic, about 150 million years ago, in a place that will one day be called Germany. This isn't a land of vast continents and deep jungles. It's an archipelago, a scattered chain of low-lying islands baking under a relentless sun. The world around you is dotted with lagoons, cut off from the main sea by reefs. The water in these lagoons is still and incredibly salty, a hostile environment for most life. As the intense sun beats down, water evaporates, leaving behind a concentrated, briny soup, so low in oxygen that almost nothing can survive in it. This is the world of Archaeopteryx, and these deadly lagoons are the secret to its immortality. When an animal from the island, like our strange crow lizard, unfortunately meets its end and falls into one of these lagoons, a remarkable process begins. The high salt content pickles its body, warding off the bacteria that would normally cause decay. The oxygen-starved water means there are no scavengers on the lagoon floor to pick the carcass apart. Slowly, gently, it sinks into the fine, carbonate mud at the bottom. This mud is like silky white flour made from the crushed shells and skeletons of countless microscopic sea creatures. Over seasons and centuries, layers of this white mud settle over the body, burying it deep within the lagoon floor. The pressure mounts, squeezing the water out, and the mud, along with the perfectly preserved creature inside, turns to stone. This is how you preserve a secret for 150 million years. This is why we can see not just the bones of Archaeopteryx, but the ghostly, perfect imprints of every single one of its feathers. Let's look closer at the creature itself, this impossible fossil. You can trace its skeleton with your finger. It's a textbook theropod dinosaur. The skull is light, but it has a full set of small, conical teeth, perfect for snapping up insects and small lizards. Its arms are long, ending in 3 distinct fingers, each tipped with a wickedly sharp, curved claw. Its legs are built for running, and behind it trails that long, bony tail, a stiff rudder made of 23 separate vertebrae. If you had found just the skeleton, you would have no doubt. You've discovered a new species of small, predatory dinosaur, something like a Compsognathus. But then there are the feathers. They change everything. They are undeniably bird-like. On its wings you can see the primary and secondary flight feathers, arranged just like those of a modern eagle. They even have a crucial, subtle detail that tells you this creature could fly. The feathers are asymmetrical. If you look at a flight feather, you'll notice the vein on the leading edge is shorter and stiffer than the vein on the trailing edge. This creates an airfoil shape, which generates lift when air flows over it. It's a masterstroke of natural engineering, and Archaeopteryx had it. This was no mere glider, it was capable of powered, flapping flight. This bizarre mix of features caught the eye of one of the 19th century's most formidable scientific minds, Thomas Henry Huxley. A brilliant anatomist and fierce public intellectual, Huxley was a friend of Charles Darwin and his most vocal and aggressive defender, earning him the nickname Darwin's Bulldog. While many of his contemporaries were scratching their heads, Huxley looked at Archaeopteryx and saw the answer to a prayer. He saw a perfect transitional fossil, a snapshot of evolution in action. He boldly asserted that this was the link, the proof that birds were not some special creation, but were the direct descendants of small, carnivorous dinosaurs. It was a stunningly insightful claim for the 1860s, a theory so ahead of its time that it would be largely dismissed and forgotten for nearly 100 years. The name given to the fossil, Archaeopteryx lithographica, is a nod to its unique context, literally meaning ancient wing from the printing stone. It's a name that perfectly captures its dual identity as both a natural wonder and a cultural artifact. Yet, despite Huxley's powerful arguments, the scientific establishment of the time pushed back. They proposed a major counter-argument that would effectively put his theory on ice. The key to avian flight, they argued, is a powerful downstroke of the wings, and this is made possible by a large breastbone and, crucially, the fusion of the collarbones into a V-shaped structure called the furcula, or as you know it, the wishbone. The wishbone acts like a spring, storing and releasing energy with each flap. The critics pointed out, correctly at the time, that no dinosaur fossil had ever been found with a furcula. Therefore, they argued, dinosaurs could not be the ancestors of birds. It was a simple, elegant argument, based on the best evidence they had. It was also, as we would later find out, completely wrong. The evidence was just still buried, waiting in the stone. So, with the lack of a wishbone as their key piece of evidence, the scientific establishment neatly packed Huxley's brilliant idea into a box, labeled it interesting but incorrect, and put it on a very high shelf to gather dust for the better part of a century. The rejection wasn't just about one missing bone, it was about a fundamental clash of perception. You have to put yourself in the mindset of a late 19th or early 20th century paleontologist. Their image of a dinosaur was something like an iguanodon or a megalosaurus, huge, lumbering, cold-blooded giants. Birds, on the other hand, are the epitome of energy. Small, fast, intelligent, and fiercely warm-blooded. The idea that one could come from the other felt absurd. It was like suggesting a battleship could evolve into a fighter jet. To fill the now empty spot on the avian family tree, an alternative theory rose to prominence. Scientists began to look for bird ancestors among a more ancient group of reptiles known as the codonts. These were smaller, generally more agile archosaurs from the Triassic period, the dawn of the dinosaurs. The idea was that the codont group split, with one branch leading to the dinosaurs and a completely separate tree-dwelling branch leading to the birds. this was a much more palatable theory. It kept the dinosaurs in their box as slow, scaly, evolutionary dead ends, and it gave birds a more respectable, independent ancestry. For decades, this became the textbook answer. Dinosaurs were failures. Birds were something else entirely. This led to a long, quiet period for dinosaur-bird relations. From the early 1900s all the way into the 1970s, dinosaurs were relegated to the slow lane of prehistory. In museums, they were often mounted in sluggish, tail-dragging poses. In the popular imagination, they were dim-witted monsters destined for extinction. They were impressive, sure, in the way a landslide is impressive, but they weren't seen as the sophisticated, dynamic animals we know today. They were a chapter to be closed. But while the theory lay dormant, the bones were still out there, waiting. And in the late 1960s, a paleontologist named John Ostrom went hunting in the Badlands of Montana and found a fossil that would kick the box right off the shelf. What Ostrom found was Deinonychus. Its name means terrible claw, and for good reason. On the second toe of each foot was a huge, sickle-shaped talon that it held retracted while walking, ready to be deployed as a lethal weapon. But it wasn't just the claw that was revolutionary. The entire skeleton of Deinonychus screamed speed and agility. It had a long, stiffened tail that acted as a perfect counterbalance for high-speed turns. Its body was light and built for leaping. This was no slow-moving lizard. This was a warm-blooded, high-performance predator. Ostrom realized he was looking at an animal that shattered every stereotype about dinosaurs. And then he noticed something else. As he studied the bones, he was struck by an uncanny sense of déjà vu. He had seen this skeleton before. It was an almost perfect, scaled-up version of Archaeopteryx. This discovery kicked off what's now called the dinosaur renaissance. It was a complete cultural and scientific overhaul of our understanding of these animals. Suddenly, paleontologists and artists started to see them in a new light. They were no longer tail-dragging swamp dwellers, but active, complex, and potentially social creatures. This is the revolution that gave us the fast, intelligent raptors of Jurassic Park. The science was finally catching up to Huxley's 100-year-old idea. Ostrom meticulously laid out the scientific evidence, pointing to dozens of shared anatomical features between his new predator and the old crow lizard. One of the most compelling was the wrist. Both Deinonychus and Archaeopteryx possessed a special half-moon-shaped bone that allowed the hand to swivel sideways. In Deinonychus, this would have been used to snatch and manipulate prey with its clawed hands. In a bird, that exact same wrist motion, the sideways flick, is the fundamental movement of the flight stroke, allowing the wing to angle for both lift and thrust. It was a stunning connection, a predatory motion repurposed for flight. But even with all this compelling new evidence, one stubborn problem remained. If birds are dinosaurs, and Deinonychus is their close cousin, where are all the feathers? Ostrom's theory was powerful, but it was still missing the final, definitive piece of the puzzle. Archaeopteryx was still a lonely, feathered island in a vast, scaly sea. The fossil record was still stubbornly silent. Historians still argue whether the cultural shift that made us see dinosaurs as exciting and dynamic was a direct result of this new science, or if the growing pop culture fascination with them actually helped fuel the funding and interest that led to these new discoveries. The search for the missing feathers was on, but no one could have predicted where they would finally be found. For the answer to that question, you have to leave the dusty plains of Montana behind. Your journey now takes you across the globe to northeastern China. You're standing in Liaoning Province, a vast expanse of rolling hills and green fields. It's a peaceful agricultural landscape where farmers have been tending their corn and sorghum for generations. But the quiet soil beneath your feet holds a secret of unimaginable violence. It's a book of the dead, a geological treasure trove that would become the single most important window into the world of the dinosaurs we have ever discovered. This place, 125 million years ago, was the absolute opposite of peaceful. It was a Mesozoic Pompeii, a land of great forests and freshwater lakes, all living under the constant shadow of active, angry volcanoes. Periodically, these volcanoes would erupt with catastrophic force, belching out clouds of fine, suffocating ash. This ash would rain down on the landscape, silently burying everything. It entombed the forests, choked the lakes, and flash fossilized any creature unlucky enough to be caught in the open. The ash was so fine that it settled like a delicate shroud, preserving not just bone, but skin, claws, beaks, and as the world was about to find out, feathers. In 1996, the story finally broke. A fossil, brought to the attention of scientists by a local collector, showed a small, graceful dinosaur, its skeleton laid out in a perfect death pose. But surrounding the skeleton, like a ghostly halo, was a faint, dark fuzz. This was Sinosauropteryx, which means Chinese reptilian wing, and it was the smoking gun that John Ostrom had been missing. It was a non-flying theropod dinosaur, undeniably covered in some kind of primitive feather. After a century of searching, the floodgates of evidence were about to burst open. These fossils from Liaoning date back to the early Cretaceous period, a time when dinosaur diversity was exploding all over the world. But only here was the preservation so perfect that it captured the soft tissues that other fossil sites lost to time. It's a slightly strange and amusing thought that many of these first, priceless specimens that would rewrite our textbooks weren't found by organized paleontological digs, but were unearthed by local farmers working their fields or digging wells. They'd find these strange dragon bones on stone slabs and sell them at local markets, often with little idea of their profound scientific value. When scientists finally got these fossils under a microscope, they saw that the structures on Sinosauropteryx were not the complex flight feathers of Archaeopteryx. They were something far more primitive. They were simple, hollow filaments, like a downy fuzz or coarse hair. This was the ancestor of the feather, what paleontologists now call a proto-feather. It was stage 1. This discovery was proof that feathers didn't just appear out of nowhere, fully formed for flight. They started as a simple coat. Of course, a discovery this revolutionary was met with immediate and fierce debate. Skeptics holding on to the old scaly paradigm were not convinced. They argued that this halo of fuzz wasn't feathers at all. They claimed the structures were simply frayed collagen fibers from under the dinosaur's skin, a product of decomposition that just happened to look like fuzz. It was a reasonable objection, a last stand for the old guard. But the dragon's nursery of Liaoning was just getting started. Sinosauropteryx wasn't a one-off. It was the first drop of rain in what was about to become a torrential downpour of evidence. Its discovery triggered a paleontological gold rush in the region, and in the years that followed, thousands of fossils of dozens of different species would be pulled from the ground, each one adding a new, undeniable brushstroke to our new portrait of the dinosaurs. So you have this small, fuzzy dinosaur. It can't fly, so its coat of proto-feathers isn't for an aerial purpose. This immediately brings up a very simple, very logical question. Why have it? The most obvious answer, one that makes perfect sense for any animal, is for warmth. But as soon as you say that, you run headlong into a century-old assumption about the world these creatures lived in. For the longest time, we pictured the entire Mesozoic era as one long, steamy, tropical vacation. The classic image is of a dinosaur standing in a humid jungle swamp, surrounded by giant ferns and cycads. In a world like that, an animal wouldn't need a winter coat. If anything, it would need to worry about overheating. The insulation hypothesis, as logical as it was, required more than just a fuzzy fossil. It required us to completely rethink the ancient climate. Fortunately, modern science has given us a set of tools that are the closest thing we have to a prehistoric weather station. It's a clever bit of geochemistry that allows us to read the climate of a lost world from the most durable part of any animal, its teeth. You are, as the saying goes, what you eat, but you are also what you drink. The water an animal drinks is absorbed into its body and used to build its tissues, including the enamel of its growing teeth. Water is made of hydrogen and oxygen comes in different varieties, or isotopes. There's the common lighter oxygen-16 and the rarer, heavier oxygen-18. The ratio of these two isotopes in rainwater is directly affected by the ambient temperature. Colder air tends to squeeze out the heavier oxygen-18, leaving precipitation richer in the lighter oxygen-16. This chemical signature of the local water gets locked into the dinosaur's tooth enamel as it forms. By analyzing that enamel millions of years later, scientists can essentially take the temperature of the world that dinosaur lived in. When geologists applied this technique to the fossil teeth of animals from the Liaoning beds, the results were stunning. The data showed that 125 million years ago, this region was not a sweltering tropical paradise. It was a temperate climate zone. The average annual temperature was similar to what you'd find in northern France or the Pacific Northwest today. It had warm summers, but it also had harsh, cold winters where temperatures would have regularly dropped below freezing. This single elegant piece of scientific evidence completely shatters the old jungle swamp image. It gives us a new, almost shocking picture to imagine. A dinosaur, seeing its breath condense in the frosty air, maybe even trudging through a snowy landscape. It's a quirky and profound mental image, forcing us to see these animals in a completely new environment. This climatic evidence is the key that unlocks the purpose of the dino fuzz. It is now widely accepted that many dinosaurs, especially the active theropods, were warm-blooded or endothermic. Just like us, and just like birds, they generated their own internal body heat. Being warm-blooded is a huge advantage. It allows you to be active and energetic regardless of the outside temperature. But it's also incredibly expensive, energetically speaking. You have to burn a lot of fuel to keep that internal furnace running. And if you're a warm-blooded animal living in a place with cold winters, you absolutely cannot afford to just let all that precious heat leak out into the environment. You need a layer of insulation. You need a coat. Suddenly, the fuzz on Archaeopteryx makes perfect sense. It wasn't a weird, random mutation. It was a vital piece of survival equipment, a prehistoric winter coat that allowed this small, energetic predator to stay active all year round, hunting and thriving even as the seasons turned cold. This discovery shifts our whole perspective. Feathers did not begin as an evolutionary leap toward the sky. They began as a practical solution to a much more down-to-earth problem: staying warm on a chilly day. The great journey to the skies started with the simple, humble need for a good coat. Of course, the exact nature of dinosaur metabolism remains a lively area of research. Paleontologists still debate the precise metabolic rates of various dinosaur species. Were they fully warm-blooded like birds and mammals, maintaining a constant high temperature, or were they something in between, a unique metabolic strategy with no modern equivalent? The evidence is mounting, but the conversation is far from over. The insulation theory works beautifully for a small, lightweight animal like Sinosauropteryx. It's easy to imagine it scurrying through the undergrowth, its downy coat puffed up against the cold. But what happens when you scale up? For a very long time, paleontologists operated on a simple principle of physics. Big animals, they argued, don't need insulation. In fact, their biggest problem is often getting rid of excess heat, not conserving it. This is a concept sometimes called gigantothermy. Think of a massive animal like an elephant, or even a giant dinosaur. Its huge body has a lot of volume relative to its surface area, meaning it generates and holds on to heat very efficiently. A giant sauropod was like a living, walking furnace. It was assumed, therefore, that as dinosaurs got bigger, they would have shed any insulating feathers their smaller ancestors might have had. It made perfect sense. A giant, fluffy predator seemed like a contradiction in terms. And then, the Liaoning fossil beds gave us the feathered tyrant. In 2012, scientists announced the discovery of a new dinosaur from those same remarkable deposits. They named it Uteranus huali, a name that perfectly blends Mandarin and Latin to mean the beautiful feathered tyrant. And it was every bit as magnificent and terrifying as its name suggests. This was a tyrannosauroid, a direct cousin of T-Rex. It was 9 meters long and weighed around 1.5 tons, the size of a rhinoceros, but with a head full of steak knives. It was the apex predator of its environment. And it was covered in feathers. This is a creature that forces you to recalibrate your entire sense of the prehistoric world. Picture it. A predator that could look you in the eye through a second-story window, a beast of muscle and bone, but wrapped in a coat of long, shaggy, filamentous feathers. This wasn't just a bit of fuzz on its head or tail. The feathers were up to 20 centimeters long, creating a thick, shaggy pelt. As a mainstream fact, Uteranus remains the largest dinosaur species ever discovered for which we have direct, unambiguous evidence of a feathery covering. Its existence was a direct challenge to the idea that big dinosaurs didn't need or want insulation. The scientific evidence for its coat comes from 3 different skeletons, found together. The feather impressions are patchy, preserved near the tail, the hip, the foot, and the neck. But their presence in these scattered areas strongly suggests the entire animal was cloaked in them. Why would a 1.5-ton predator need a winter coat? The answer goes back to the climate. Uteranus lived in that same temperate Liaoning environment with its chilly winters. Even for a giant, a warm coat could have made the difference, allowing it to conserve energy and hunt more efficiently during the cold season. Naturally, the discovery of a feathered tyrannosaur immediately raised the million-dollar question. What about the king himself? Was Tyrannosaurus rex feathered? The idea has become a source of both fascination and fierce debate. Some artists began depicting a fluffy T-Rex, which to some looked less like a fearsome tyrant and more like a giant, terrifying chicken, a quirky tidbit that has launched 1,000 memes. The actual evidence is tantalizingly incomplete. We have found small patches of fossilized skin impressions from adult T-Rex, from the tail, hip, and neck, and they clearly show small, pebbly scales, not feathers. But these patches are tiny compared to the whole animal. It's like finding a bald spot on a person and declaring they have no hair. It's entirely possible T-Rex had a mixed coat, with scales on some parts of its body and feathers on others, perhaps a shaggy mane down its back and neck. This leads us to the heart of the scholarly debate today. The extent of feathers on Tyrannosaurus is a hot-button issue. One popular hypothesis is that baby T-Rex hatched covered in a downy coat of feathers for warmth, just like modern bird chicks, and then shed most of them as they grew to their enormous adult size, retaining maybe a few for display. Did they have a mix of scales and feathers? Did feather coverage vary by where they lived? For now, we don't have a definitive answer. The tyrant king is still keeping some of his secrets. Knowing that a giant tyrant could be covered in shaggy down completely changes the picture. But it also opens up a new, even more exciting line of questioning. For over 100 years, the question of what color the dinosaurs were belonged to the realm of pure fantasy. Artists would paint them in drab greens and muddy browns, mostly because it seemed sensible for giant animals trying to hide in a forest. There was no way to know for sure, so why not? But the same geological magic that preserved the feathers of Liaoning also preserved a secret hidden inside them, a secret so small it would take an electron microscope to find it. The secret of color itself. Your journey now takes you down to the microscopic level. Imagine you're hovering over the fossil feather of a Sinosauropteryx. You zoom in, past the texture of the stone, past the elegant outline of the feather's structure, down to a level where you can see the ghost of individual cells. And there, inside those cells, are impossibly tiny oblong shapes, like grains of rice or miniature meatballs. These are fossilized melanosomes. In life, these are the microscopic organelles inside a cell that are filled with melanin, the same pigment that gives color to your hair and skin. They are microscopic time capsules of color, and scientists have cracked their code. It turns out that the shape of the melanosome tells you the color it contained. There are two main types. Long, thin, sausage-shaped ones are called eumelanosomes, and they produce black and gray pigments. Round, fat, meatball-shaped ones are phaeomelanosomes, and they produce reddish-brown and yellow pigments. By identifying the shape of these fossilized sacs, scientists can literally map the color patterns of an animal that has been dead for 125 million years. It's one of the most brilliant and unexpected breakthroughs in the history of paleontology. In 2010, an international team of scientists did exactly this with the original Sinosauropteryx fossil. They painstakingly took microscopic samples from all over its body and mapped out the types of melanosomes they found. The results were breathtakingly specific and beautiful. Sinosauropteryx was not a drab, single-colored creature. Its back and sides were a rich reddish-brown, the color of chestnut or a red squirrel. Its belly was pale, a pattern known as countershading, which is a common form of camouflage used by countless animals today to help them blend in by reducing the effect of their own shadow. And the most striking feature of all was its long tail. It was decorated with alternating vivid rings of russet orange and clean white. This was not the skin of a lizard. This was the patterned coat of a complex, modern-looking animal, like a raccoon or a ring-tailed lemur. It's a crucial mainstream fact to remember that this ability to scientifically determine the color of extinct animals is an incredibly recent development. Before the late 2000s, any depiction of a dinosaur's color was, at best, a highly educated guess. Now, for certain exceptionally preserved fossils, we can know. As a quirky tidbit, one of the very first dinosaurs to get a full-color makeover was Anchiornis, that four-winged contemporary of Archaeopteryx. Its patterns were even more dramatic, revealing a creature with a dark gray and black body, spectacular white stripes and spots on its wings, and a stunning reddish-orange crest on its head, like a punk rock woodpecker. These creatures were not trying to be boring. But this incredible technique has its limits, leading to a new scholarly debate. The melanosome method is fantastic for revealing patterns of blacks, greys, and browns. But what about the other colors in nature's palette? Shimmering, iridescent colors, like the metallic sheen on a peacock or a starling, are not just created by pigment, but by the microscopic structure of the feather itself, which reflects light in dazzling ways. These delicate structures are almost never preserved in fossils. Furthermore, bright reds, oranges, and yellows in modern birds often come from pigments called carotenoids, which they get from their diet. Think of the pink of a flamingo or the scarlet of a cardinal. These pigments don't fossilize at all. So paleontologists still argue how much of the original living color we are truly seeing. We have the base tones, but the most brilliant, dazzling hues may be lost to time forever, leaving us with a beautiful but perhaps incomplete picture of this lost world. Knowing that these animals were decorated in such vibrant, specific patterns of color pushes us to ask another question. Color isn't always for hiding. Sometimes it's for the exact opposite, to be seen, to stand out, to make a statement. Once you have a coat, you can start using it for fashion and communication. Your journey through the Liaoning forest now brings you face to face with a creature that seems to have taken this idea to heart. It's about the size of a turkey, with long, powerful legs clearly built for running. It has a short, boxy skull and a beak-like mouth, but your attention is immediately drawn to its arms and its tail. They are adorned with feathers, but not the simple fuzz you saw on Archaeopteryx. These are something else entirely. This is Archaeopteryx. Looking closely at this strange animal, you notice it has two types of feathers. Its body is covered in the familiar, simple, downy proto-feathers, clearly for warmth. But sprouting from its short tail and arranged like a fan on its small, stubby arms are much more complex structures. They have a stiff central shaft, the rachis, with delicate barbs branching off from either side. They look, for all the world, like modern feathers. But they hold a subtle, crucial secret that tells you they were never meant to get this animal off the ground. Here is the scientific evidence, a simple lesson in aerodynamics. If you were to hold one of these arm feathers, you would see that it's almost perfectly symmetrical. The vein on the leading edge is a mirror image of the vein on the trailing edge. When air flows over a shape like this, the pressure above and below it is equal. It generates no lift. It's an aerodynamic dud. An animal covered in these feathers could flap its arms as hard as it wanted, and it would never leave the ground. So, you have a flightless, fast-running dinosaur with useless but very large and ornate feathers on its arms and tail. The function, then, must not have been aerodynamic. It must have been social. These were not wings. They were billboards. You can almost see the behavior playing out in your mind's eye. A male Archaeopteryx trying to impress a potential mate. He fans out the spray of long feathers on his tail, creating a beautiful striped display. He holds out his arms and shakes them, rattling his arm feathers, showing off their size and perfection. This was a creature built for showing off. It was the dinosaur equivalent of a peacock, a living example of a powerful force in nature first described by Darwin himself. This mainstream historical fact is known as sexual selection. It's the idea that some traits evolve not because they help an animal survive, but simply because they make it more attractive to the opposite sex. A massive, shimmering tail doesn't help a peacock hide from tigers, but it's what the peahens look for, so the genes for spectacular tails get passed on. Archaeopteryx was one of the first clear signs that this same force was shaping the dinosaurs. And while this creature was busy with its flashy courtship displays, its insides were focused on a much less glamorous task. As a quirky or fringe tidbit, many Archaeopteryx fossils are found with a neat pile of small, polished stones located where their stomach would have been. These are gastroliths, or stomach stones. The animal would swallow them, and the muscular churning of its gizzard would use these stones to grind up tough plant material, like seeds and fibrous stems. So this show-off was a vegetarian, a flashy herbivore strutting its stuff through the Cretaceous undergrowth. This, of course, opens up a fascinating open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether these displays were purely visual. How complex were they? Did they involve sound, like beak clacking or deep resonant calls? Did they perform elaborate, ritualized dances like a modern bird of paradise? We can only speculate, using the behavior of their living descendants as a guide to these lost, silent ballets. Feathers had now found a third grand purpose, from insulation to camouflage to the high-stakes game of courtship. The stage was now set for the final, most dramatic evolutionary leap. The journey has now shown you feathers for warmth and feathers for showing off. You've seen them evolve from simple fuzz into complex, banner-like structures. But the sky has remained stubbornly out of reach. All the evolutionary drivers so far have been firmly planted on the ground. How, then, do you make that final, spectacular leap into the air? For that, you have to meet what is arguably the most bizarre and beautiful dinosaur ever discovered. Your eyes are drawn from the forest floor up into the canopy, into a world of tangled branches and dappled light. And there you see it. A creature no bigger than a crow, a sleek little predator stalking through the high branches. It looks like a miniature velociraptor, but with a crucial, shocking difference. It has wings on its arms, and it has wings on its legs. This is Microraptor, the small thief. And it is one of the most important fossils ever found for understanding the origin of flight. Discovered in those same liaoning beds, this little dromaeosaur was a game-changer. For here, finally, were feathers that were unambiguously built for interacting with the air. The long feathers on all four of its limbs displayed the key innovation that separates a display plume from a tool of flight. If you look closely, you can see that they are asymmetrical. The leading edge of each feather, the part that cuts into the wind, is short and stiff. The trailing edge is longer and more flexible. This is the classic airfoil shape, the exact same principle of engineering that allows a modern bird or a 747 to generate lift. This was it. The leap from the ground to the air was happening. It's a fantastic, mainstream historical fact that Microraptor belongs to the dromaeosaurid family, the group of dinosaurs we popularly call raptors. This means that the fearsome pack hunters of Jurassic Park fame were, in reality, much closer to birds than we ever imagined, with some of their smaller cousins being four-winged gliders. The line between bird and dinosaur was becoming almost invisibly thin. But was this four-winged setup really viable? Could an animal actually fly like that? To answer that, scientists turned to modern engineering. This is the scientific evidence. They built detailed models of Microraptor based on the exquisite fossils and put them into wind tunnels. They tested different configurations, adjusting the angles of the arms and the legs, and what they found was that the four-wing, or biplane, configuration was not just stable, it was a highly effective way to glide. The hind wings acted like the rear wings of a biplane, adding lift and stability, allowing Microraptor to perform controlled aerial descents. It could cover significant distances, gliding from tree to tree in its forest home. This discovery, however, has a slightly scandalous backstory, a perfect quirky or fringe tidbit that shows the messy human side of science. In 1999, before the truly beautiful and complete Microraptor fossils were officially described, a fossil called Archaeopteryx was unveiled. It was a sensation, a dinosaur body with bird-like wings. The problem was, it was a fake. A clever Chinese farmer had glued the front half of a primitive bird onto the tail and legs of a small dinosaur to create a more impressive-looking and more valuable specimen. The ensuing scandal was a brief black eye for paleontology, but it also spurred researchers on. And soon after, they began to find the real deal: numerous, authentic, and undeniably four-winged skeletons of Microraptor that were even more incredible than the fake. This creature's anatomy tells you everything about its lifestyle. It was not a ground dweller. Its long leg feathers would have been a clumsy hindrance for running, but its sharp, curved claws on both hands and feet were perfectly adapted for climbing, for scrambling up the bark of the giant ginkgo and conifer trees of its environment. You can picture it. It would climb to a high branch, spot its prey, a lizard, a small mammal, or even an early bird, on a tree across a clearing, and then it would launch itself into the air, a four-winged, feathered missile gliding silently across the gap. But there is still an ongoing puzzle. Biomechanical experts and paleontologists still argue about the exact positioning of those leg wings during flight. Did Microraptor hold its legs out to the side, creating a true biplane shape? Or were they held underneath its body, perhaps angled backwards to form a single aerodynamic surface with the tail? Different models suggest different advantages, and without a living one to watch, the beautiful silent flight of this four-winged dragon remains, in part, a mystery. Let's stay in that high canopy for a while. Your journey now places you firmly in the world of Microraptor. Imagine yourself perched on the branch of a giant ginkgo tree, its fan-shaped leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. Below you, the forest floor is a deep, shadowy world of ferns and cycads. The air smells of damp earth and pine resin from the ancient conifers that tower around you. This is a vertical world, a landscape of opportunity and danger defined not by distance, but by height. It is this world, this multi-layered forest, that gave birth to one of the two great ideas about how life took to the air. This is the home of the trees down theory. The idea is simple and intuitive. Flight began not with a frantic running start on the ground, but with the simple act of falling. For a small animal living in the trees, falling is a constant risk. But if you can evolve a way to turn an accidental fall into a controlled glide, you've suddenly turned a deadly hazard into a massive advantage. You can escape tree-climbing predators. You can move from tree to tree without having to make the dangerous journey down to the forest floor and back up again. You can cross rivers and clearings with ease. This theory, also called the arboreal theory, posits that flight evolved in stages. First climbing, then parachuting, then gliding, and finally, true powered flight. And Microraptor, with its climber's claws and four glider's wings, is its perfect poster child. You are looking at a prehistoric base jumper. Let's watch one for a moment. A small mammal, an early relative of ours, scurries along a branch on a neighboring tree. The microraptor is motionless, its eyes fixed. Then, it simply leaps. For a heart-stopping second, it plummets. But then it extends all 4 limbs, and its feathers catch the air. Its body becomes a complex, living kite. The glide is silent and swift. You can see the sunlight catch on its feathers. And thanks to the miraculous preservation of melanosomes, we know what you would see. As a quirky or fringe tidbit, we know its feathers had the microscopic structure to create iridescence. It wouldn't just be black. It would shimmer with a glossy sheen of blues and greens, like a modern crow or a European starling. A silent, iridescent missile gliding through the Cretaceous forest. It adjusts the angle of its arms, tilts its leg wings, using them to steer as it closes the distance. It lands with a soft thud on the target branch, its sharp claws finding purchase in the bark, and the hunt is over. This lifestyle required an adaptable diet. The scientific evidence for what it ate comes, quite literally, from its gut. In the fossilized stomach contents of one microraptor, scientists found the bones of a small, fish-eating bird. In another, they found the remains of a fish. In yet another, a lizard. This tells us Microraptor was a versatile predator, hunting other tree dwellers, but also capable of gliding down to snatch prey from near the water's edge. Of course, this graceful aerial existence came at a cost. Once on the ground, the story changes. You can see how its long leg feathers, so brilliant in the air, would become a clumsy liability on a flat surface. They would get tangled, drag in the mud, and make a fast run almost impossible. This stark contrast between its grace in the air and its awkwardness on land is a powerful argument for its tree-dwelling life. This brings us to the great opposing idea, the mainstream historical fact known as the ground-up or cursorial theory. This theory suggests flight began with fast-running ground animals that used their feathered arms for balance, as a net to catch insects, or to provide a little extra lift to increase their leaping height while chasing prey. For a long time, this was a popular theory, but creatures like Microraptor have tipped the scales heavily in favor of a trees-down origin. This leaves us with a final fascinating puzzle and an open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the four-winged stage was a necessary evolutionary step for all birds. Was Microraptor on the direct ancestral line, a grandmother to the birds we know today, who later evolved to tuck their leg wings away? Or was it a member of a strange and wonderful side branch, a fascinating experiment in flight design that ultimately proved to be an evolutionary dead end? We don't know for sure. But what is certain is that for millions of years, the forests of ancient China were home to these shimmering, four-winged dragons, a beautiful and bizarre chapter in the story of life's journey to the sky. Your journey must now take a step backward in time. You've just seen the sophisticated gliding of the four-winged Microraptor from the early Cretaceous. But to solve a nagging paradox, a kind of time travel problem that plagued paleontologists for decades, you have to travel deeper into the past. You're now in the late Jurassic, around 160 million years ago. The forests here are subtly different, dominated by ancient tree ferns and cycads. And it is here that you meet another four-winged creature, a dinosaur named Anchiornis huxleyi. At first glance, it looks very similar to Microraptor, small, feathered, with long plumes on both its arms and legs. But this creature is special. It holds the key to fixing a broken timeline. The significance of Anchiornis is not just in its four wings, but in its age. It is 15 million years older than Microraptor and, crucially, about 10 million years older than Archaeopteryx, the creature we've long called the first bird. This fact is a bomb that dismantles one of the most persistent arguments against the dinosaur-to-bird theory. For years, critics would point to what they called the temporal paradox. It went like this. If birds evolved from dinosaurs like Velociraptor, why is the oldest known bird, Archaeopteryx, millions of years older than its supposed closest relatives? The most bird-like raptors we knew of lived in the Cretaceous, long after Archaeopteryx was flying around. It was like finding a photograph of a grandfather who was born 10 years after his own grandson. It didn't make sense, and for a long time, it was a genuine thorn in the side of the theory. Anchiornis fixed this paradox in the most spectacular way possible. Its discovery was the fossil equivalent of finding the grandfather's real birth certificate. Here was a highly bird-like, four-winged dromaeosaur that lived and died long before Archaeopteryx. It proved that the ancestors were in the right place at the right time. The reason we found the grandson first was simply due to the luck of the fossil record. And as a perfect mainstream historical fact, its name, Anchiornis huxleyi, was a deliberate and fitting tribute. It means Huxley's near bird, a posthumous nod to Thomas Henry Huxley, the man who had correctly called the dinosaur-bird connection a full century before the evidence finally caught up with him. The scientific evidence provided by Anchiornis is more than just a date. It's a beautiful snapshot of evolution in progress. By proving that feathery, bird-like dinosaurs were already experimenting with flight mechanics well before Archaeopteryx, it reinforces a crucial idea. Evolution is not a neat, straight line. It's not a ladder where each rung leads directly and purposefully to the next. It's a vast, messy, branching bush. It's a story of constant trial and error. The four-winged body plan, which you've now seen in both Anchiornis and Microraptor, was clearly a successful experiment that nature tried for millions of years. It was a viable way to get airborne. But eventually, a different body plan, the two-winged design that streamlined the legs for running or perching, proved to be even more successful and became the one that would survive to the present day. And what an astonishing-looking experiment it was! As a truly delightful, quirky or fringe tidbit, Anchiornis has the distinction of being the very first dinosaur to have its complete, lifelike color pattern scientifically reconstructed down to the last feather. Scientists studied the fossilized melanosomes on an incredibly well-preserved specimen and were able to paint a full-color portrait. The result was breathtaking. Anchiornis had a body of dark gray and black feathers. Its wings were adorned with bold white and black stripes, creating a stunning spangled or barred pattern. And to top it all off, it sported a dramatic, reddish-brown crest of long feathers on its head. It was a creature of incredible punk rock beauty, a flash of vibrant life in the Jurassic forests. This detailed picture of its appearance, however, leads to another question, and a new open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether Anchiornis was a true flyer or just a glider. Its feathers, though complex, were less aerodynamically advanced than those of the later Microraptor. They were narrower and more symmetrical, suggesting they would have been less efficient at generating lift. Was it only capable of simple parachuting or clumsy gliding? Or could it achieve some form of weak, powered flight? Its existence solves the time paradox, but it gives us a new puzzle, showing us an even earlier, perhaps clumsier stage in the long and messy process of learning to fly. You have spent so much time now among these incredibly bird-like dinosaurs that the line has started to blur. You've seen feathered raptors that glide and feathered tyrants that hunted in the cold. So where do we finally draw that line? At what point do you stop calling it a dinosaur and start calling it a bird? To find the answer, your journey takes you back to the rich fossil beds of Liaoning. Lying in the same rock layers as Microraptor, preserved in the same volcanic ash, is another winged creature. But this one is different. This one has taken the final decisive steps across that blurry line. This is Confucius ornis. Immediately you can see what makes it a bird. The most important change is at the back. Gone is the long, bony reptilian tail of Archaeopteryx and the raptors. In its place is a short, fused bone structure called a pygostyle. If you've ever prepared a chicken or a turkey, you've seen this bone. It's the part that anchors all the tail feathers, often called the parson's nose. The evolution of the pygostyle is a huge leap. It's the shift from a stiff, simple rudder to a complex, adjustable fan of feathers that can be used for precision steering, braking, and stabilization in the air. The other crucial change is at the front. The toothy snout of its ancestors is gone, replaced by a true, modern, toothless beak. These are the features that tell you you're looking at a true, albeit primitive, bird. The fossil record here is astonishingly rich. As a mainstream historical fact, paleontologists have unearthed thousands of specimens of Confucius ornis, making it the most abundant and best understood bird from the entire Mesozoic era. This wealth of fossils gives us an unparalleled look at an entire population. But even as it takes these great leaps forward, Confucius ornis still carries the echoes of its deep past. If you look closely at its wings, you can see that its fingers are not fully fused together, like a modern bird's. Sticking out from the front edge of each wing is a prominent, sharp claw. It was a bird, but a bird that could still climb. You can picture it, scrambling up the trunks of trees, using its wing claws for grip, much like the modern Hoatzin chick of South America does today. A living ghost of this ancient anatomy. The thousands of fossils also reveal a wonderful, quirky or fringe tidbit about their lives and loves. About half of the skeletons are found with a pair of long, elegant, ribbon-like feathers trailing from their tails. The other half have none. This is clear evidence of sexual dimorphism, a distinct difference in appearance between males and females. It's believed the males were the ones with the long, flashy streamers, using them in courtship displays to woo the females, proving that the tradition of showing off, which you saw in Archaeopteryx, was alive and well in the very first bird communities. All of this anatomical evidence, the beak, the claws, the tail, leads to the critical question, and a fascinating open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether Confucius ornis was a truly accomplished flyer. The pygostyle and modern-looking feathers suggest it was. However, some scientists point to the structure of its shoulder. They argue that its anatomy would have made a powerful, flapping upstroke difficult, meaning it might have been a clumsy, heavy flyer, perhaps only capable of short bursts of flight. Others disagree, believing it was perfectly capable. It was a bird, yes, but it was a bird at the very dawn of avian flight, a pioneer still figuring out the finer points of mastering the air. As these first true birds, like Confucius ornis, took their clumsy, flapping leaps into the world, you might imagine the sky as a vast, empty frontier, a blue ocean of air just waiting to be conquered. But that would be a profound mistake. The sky was already taken. It had been ruled for nearly 80 million years by another dynasty of flying creatures, a group of magnificent and bizarre reptiles that had mastered the air long before the first feather ever evolved for flight. Your journey now lifts you high above the Liaoning forests into the crowded Mesozoic skies to meet the original masters of the air. You see them soaring on the thermals, creatures of skin and bone against the clouds. These are the pterosaurs. And the first and most important thing you have to understand about them is that they are not dinosaurs. They are a completely separate, though related, branch of the great Archosaur family tree. They were the very first vertebrates to evolve powered flight, and their solution to the problem of getting airborne was radically different from the one the birds would eventually stumble upon. Where a bird's wing is a complex tapestry of interlocking feathers, a pterosaur's wing was a marvel of minimalist engineering. It was formed by a membrane of skin and muscle, stretched taut between the side of its body and a single, absurdly elongated fourth finger. The other three fingers remained small and clawed, often used for walking or climbing. It was a leathery wing, more like a bat's than a bird's, a brilliant but ultimately less versatile design. For over 150 million years, this design was a staggering success. This is a mainstream historical fact. The pterosaurs were an incredibly diverse group, filling every conceivable aerial niche. They ranged in size from the sparrow-sized Nemicalopterus to the truly colossal Quetzalcoatlus, a creature with the wingspan of a modern F-16 fighter jet that would have stood as tall as a giraffe when on the ground. They were the undisputed rulers of the sky for an almost unimaginable length of time. So, as the first birds began to flutter, they weren't entering an empty stage. They were the new kids on the block, trying to make a living in a world dominated by these leathery winged incumbents. What followed was a long, slow-motion story of competition between two dynasties. Early on, the pterosaurs were the clear masters of the open skies and soaring flight. But the birds, with their feathered wings, had an edge in maneuverability and bursts of speed, especially in cluttered environments like forests. And we can see the story of this rivalry playing out in the rock itself. This is the scientific evidence. As you move through the Cretaceous period in the fossil record, you see two trends happening at the same time. The diversity of small to medium-sized pterosaurs begins to decline. But the diversity of bird species, particularly small perching birds, absolutely explodes. The correlation is too strong to ignore. It seems the new feathered flyers were outcompeting their older rivals, pushing them out of the smaller ecological niches, leaving only the giant soaring specialists to carry the pterosaur name to the end of the era. In a wonderful case of nature rhyming, it turns out the pterosaurs had also dealt with the problem of staying warm. As a fascinating quirky or fringe tidbit, many well-preserved pterosaur fossils, like a species called saurders, show they were covered in a dense, hair-like fuzz. This coat, made of filaments called pycnofibers, is not related to feathers, but it served the exact same purpose: insulation for a warm-blooded, active lifestyle. It's a perfect example of convergent evolution, where two completely separate lineages independently arrive at the same solution to a common problem. This all leads to a compelling picture of a changing of the guard in the ancient skies. But was it really that simple? Historians still argue whether the rise of the birds was the direct cause of the pterosaurs' decline. Did the birds actively drive them to extinction through superior competition? Or were both groups simply reacting to a changing world? Perhaps shifts in the climate or the rise of new kinds of forests and flowering plants favored the birds' way of life, and the pterosaurs were simply unable to adapt as effectively. The case isn't closed, but the evidence in the rock tells a clear story. As the feathered dynasty rose, the leathery one began to fade. Your journey now takes you on a great leap northward, away from the temperate forests of Liaoning. You are traveling across a vast, open landscape that will one day be the cold, arid steppe of Siberia. You stand near the Kulinda River, under a wide, pale sky. The environment here feels different, harsher, more exposed. And it is in this remote and unexpected place that a discovery would be made in 2014 that was so profound, it would be like finding out that not only did your distant cousins evolve a unique family trait, but that the mailman and the neighbors down the street did too. It would force a complete re-evaluation of the entire family tree. Up to this point, the story of feathered dinosaurs, for all its revolutionary twists and turns, had been a family affair. Every single feathered dinosaur ever found, from the fuzzy Sinosauropteryx to the four-winged Microraptor to the giant Uteranus, belonged to one group, the theropods. They were all members of the carnivorous lineage that would eventually lead to birds. This created a neat, tidy narrative. Feathers, it seemed, were a special theropod innovation, the secret sauce that allowed this one particular group to experiment with new forms of insulation, display, and eventually, flight. But the Siberian soil was about to shatter that neat little story forever. Paleontologists digging here found the fragmentary remains of a small, two-legged dinosaur. The bones were jumbled, but they were associated with clear impressions of its skin and body covering. They named it Kulindadromeus. And here is the revolutionary fact. Kulindadromeus was not a theropod. It was an ornithischian. This is a mainstream historical fact of colossal importance. The ornithischians are the bird-hipped dinosaurs, one of the two great branches of the dinosaur family tree, and they are completely separate from the theropods. This is the group that includes the armored stegosaurus, the horned triceratops, and the duck-billed hadrosaurs. They are the great herbivores. Finding a feathered dinosaur here was like finding a whale with wings. The shocking revelation was unavoidable. This was a plant-eating dinosaur covered in feathers. The scientific evidence was unmistakable. The fossils showed not just one type of body covering, but a whole wardrobe. Its tail was covered in overlapping scales, much like a classic reptile. But its torso and limbs were covered in simple, bristle-like filaments, a type of proto-feather. And even more bizarrely, its lower legs were adorned with complex, ribbon-like structures, something never seen before. This variety on a single animal proved that these weren't just preservation artifacts. This was the living reality of this creature's skin. As a quirky or fringe tidbit, its full name, Kulindadromeus zabaikalicus, is a simple descriptive label, meaning the Kulinda runner from the Zabaical region, a humble name for a creature that represents a seismic shift in our understanding. Because the implication of a feathered ornithischian is staggering. The theropods and the ornithischians are two lineages that split from each other at the very dawn of the dinosaur age, way back in the Triassic period. For both of these wildly different groups to have feathers, it's extremely unlikely that they would have evolved them independently. The far more logical and mind-boggling conclusion is that the trait was there from the very beginning. The common ancestor of all dinosaurs, a creature that lived over 220 million years ago, likely had feathers. The story of feathers wasn't a theropod story after all. It was the story of the dinosaurs themselves. This single, scruffy Siberian herbivore changes the entire equation. The discovery of Kulindadromeus is like a key that unlocks a hidden door in the dinosaur family tree. And when you step through it, the whole landscape of the past looks different. Think about it like this. You have two vast and completely separate family lineages, the carnivorous theropods and the herbivorous ornithischians. They went their separate ways at the very beginning. For 150 years, we thought only one of those families, the theropods, carried the special genetic secret for growing feathers. But now you've found feathers in the other family too. For such a complex, unique structure to have evolved twice in two separate lineages would be an evolutionary coincidence of astronomical proportions. It's far more likely, in fact, it's almost certain, that they didn't evolve it separately at all. They inherited it. You have to travel back, past the Cretaceous, past the Jurassic, to the dawn of the dinosaurs in the late Triassic, over 220 million years ago. Here you find the common ancestor, the great-great-great-grandparent of them all. This is the creature from which both the mighty T-Rex and the placid Triceratops would eventually descend. And the discovery in Siberia leads to a stunning conclusion. This first ancestral dinosaur must have had some kind of primitive feather, a simple filament-like fuzz. This means feathers are not a late-game innovation that led to birds. Feathers might be as old as the dinosaurs themselves, a fundamental part of their original body plan. This is a profound reframing of their entire history, and it helps make sense of a famously confusing mainstream historical fact about how dinosaurs are classified. The family tree is split into two great branches based on the shape of their hips, the Sauriskia, or lizard-hipped, and the Ornithischia, or bird-hipped. The great irony is that birds evolved from the lizard-hipped line, not the bird-hipped one. For years, this was just a weird piece of trivia. But if the common ancestor had feathers, it means the potential for bird-like features was baked into both sides of the family from the very beginning. This revelation completely flips our core question on its head. For more than a century, the question we asked was, which dinosaurs evolved feathers? Now we are forced to ask a new, much more interesting question. Which dinosaurs lost them? The fuzzy coat becomes the default setting, the factory model for a dinosaur. The thick, scaly skin we see on a creature like an adult Triceratops or a giant sauropod may not be the original condition at all. It might be a secondary adaptation. Perhaps as these animals grew to titanic sizes, they no longer needed the insulation and reverted to scaly skin to better shed heat. Maybe the evolution of thick, armored plates made a coat of feathers redundant. Scales are no longer the boring default. They are an interesting evolutionary choice that requires an explanation. The scientific reasoning behind this grand conclusion is a core principle that guides all of modern science. It's called the principle of parsimony, more famously known as Occam's razor. This is the scientific evidence. The principle states that when faced with competing explanations for the same phenomenon, the simplest one, the one that requires the fewest assumptions, is the most likely to be correct. A single origin for feathers early in the dinosaur lineage is a much simpler and more elegant explanation than proposing that this incredibly complex structure evolved multiple times in exactly the same way. This new feathers-first model gives us a wonderful and quirky or fringe tidbit to imagine. The giant, long-necked sauropods, the largest land animals that ever lived, may have hatched from their eggs as fuzzy, down-covered babies, looking like colossal, awkward chicks, only shedding their warm coats as they grew into their mountain-sized adult forms. The image is almost too charming to believe, yet it's a genuine scientific possibility. Of course, this is the absolute cutting edge of paleontology, and it represents a new and ongoing scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this new model is the final word. Not all paleontologists are convinced. Some suggest the bristle-like structures on Coelindodromeus are not true proto-feathers, but a different kind of structure that evolved convergently. To truly solve the mystery, the hunt is now on for even older fossils, for well-preserved skin from the very first dinosaurs of the Triassic, to find the ultimate proof of this fuzzy, shared ancestry. The Siberian discovery forces you to become a sort of prehistoric tailor, assessing the wardrobe choices of an entire dynasty. The old, simple rule that theropods are fluffy and everyone else is scaly is gone forever. In its place is a much more dynamic story. You must now picture the default ancestral dinosaur as a small, energetic, fuzzy creature. From this starting point, every dinosaur group had to make a choice. Keep the coat, modify it, or trade it in for something else entirely. This great sorting began very early, right after the first dinosaurs appeared, when the family split into its two great houses. On one side, you have the Ornithischia, the bird-hipped herbivores. We know from Coulindodromius that this branch of the family started with feathers. But as you follow their lineage through time, you see them making a consistent trade. They swapped their soft, feathery coats for a different kind of protection. Armor. Think of their most famous descendants. Stegosaurus, with its back covered in giant bony plates and its tail armed with deadly spikes. Ankylosaurus, a living tank, covered head to tail in thick, bony scutes. And Triceratops, with its immense shield of bone protecting its neck, and its face bristling with horns. The skin impressions we have from these animals show scales and tough, bumpy skin, not feathers. For them, the evolutionary path led to becoming walking fortresses, and a downy coat had no place on a suit of armor. As a key mainstream historical fact, the Ornithischian group is defined not just by their hips, but by a unique bone at the front of their lower jaw called a predentary. It was a scoop-like bone, often covered in a beak, perfect for cropping tough vegetation. Now, turn your attention to the other great house, the Saurischia, or lizard-hipped dinosaurs. This lineage also split in two early on. One path led to the sauropodomorphs, the famous long-necked giants like Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus. Their evolutionary strategy was simple. Get big. Incredibly, impossibly big. Like their heavily armored Ornithischian cousins, the adult sauropods seem to have abandoned their ancestral fuzz. Their colossal size was more than enough to maintain a stable body temperature, and shedding excess heat would have been a much bigger problem for them than staying warm. The hypothesis that they were born as fuzzy giants in the making remains a charming possibility. But for the adults, scales were likely the more practical attire. This leaves one final path, the other branch of the lizard-hipped house. The theropods. This was the line that kept the coat. While their relatives were busy evolving into tanks, mountains of flesh, and horned fortresses, the theropods stuck with their insulation. But they didn't just keep it. They refined it, experimented with it, and turned it into the most versatile bodily structure nature has ever produced. They were the innovators who would eventually unlock the feather's true potential. As a quirky tidbit that adds a layer of delightful confusion, the name Saurischia, lizard-hipped, is a complete misnomer for the group that actually produced birds. While their hips started out in a classic reptilian arrangement, the specific group of theropods on the path to flight independently rotated their hip bones into a position that was functionally identical to that of the bird-hipped dinosaurs, a perfect case of convergent evolution where two different groups arrive at the same solution. The scientific evidence is clear that many of these lineages did indeed lose their ancestral fuzz. We have beautifully preserved skin impressions from dinosaurs like the theropod Carnotaurus, showing its skin was covered in a mosaic of small scales and large conical bumps with no hint of feathers. Likewise, fossils of the hadrosaur Edmontosaurus have revealed a tough, scaly hide. This isn't evidence against the feathers first model. It's proof of the diverse evolutionary paths different dinosaurs took. This leads to a new scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether some of the more bizarre skin structures we see, like the long, porcupine-like quills found on the tail of Psittacosaurus, an early horned dinosaur, represent a unique type of feather that only the Ornithischian line developed, or if they are a completely different kind of structure altogether, proving that dinosaur skin was even more experimental than we ever imagined. You are now standing in a world at its absolute zenith, a planet teeming with the breathtaking results of 150 million years of dinosaur evolution. Around you, in a forest in what will one day be North America, the air is alive. A herd of horned triceratops moves through the undergrowth like a procession of armored titans. In the trees, small, bird-like maniraptorans chase insects. In the distance, a colossal Tyrannosaurus rex lets out a roar that shakes the very air you breathe. The world is a complex, stable, and successful ecosystem, the product of countless evolutionary experiments. But you feel a sudden, strange stillness. The insects stop humming. The birds fall silent. And you look up. High in the blue sky, a new star has appeared. In the middle of the day, a point of light is growing brighter, second by second, moving with an impossible, silent speed. It is a 10-kilometer-wide mountain of rock and metal, an asteroid that has been traveling through the void for billions of years, and its journey is about to end. When it hits the atmosphere, it ignites, becoming a sun that fills a quarter of the sky, silently searing the landscape below with pure, raw heat. Then, it strikes the shallow sea of the Yucatan Peninsula. The moment of impact is beyond all human comprehension of violence. The asteroid vaporizes instantly, along with trillions of tons of the Earth's crust, in a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns. The energy released is equivalent to over 1 billion of the most powerful nuclear bombs ever created. A searing heat pulse, a wave of thermal radiation traveling at the speed of light, radiates from the impact site, incinerating everything for 1,000 kilometers in every direction. An earthquake so powerful it registers on no imaginable scale shakes the entire planet, triggering volcanic eruptions and landslides on the opposite side of the world. The impact carves a crater 180 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep, throwing a curtain of molten rock and superheated dust high above the atmosphere, which then begins to rain back down across the globe as fiery glass beads. This was the day the world ended. The mainstream historical fact is now overwhelmingly clear. 66 million years ago, a massive asteroid impact at a site known as Chicxulub in modern-day Mexico triggered the Cretaceous Paleogene, KPG, mass extinction event, which wiped out 75% of all species on Earth. The scientific evidence for this is elegantly simple and globally consistent. All around the world there is a thin, dark line in the rock strata that separates the age of dinosaurs from the age of mammals. This is the KPG boundary, and within this layer there is a massive spike in the concentration of the element iridium. Iridium is incredibly rare in the Earth's crust, but it is abundant in asteroids and comets. It is the chemical signature of the murder weapon, a fine dusting of the vaporized asteroid that settled out of the atmosphere across the entire planet. But the story might be even more complex. As a quirky or fringe tidbit, at the exact same time on the geological clock, on the other side of the planet in what is now India, a series of volcanic eruptions on a truly epic scale were underway. The Deccan Traps, as they are known, were spewing enough lava to cover the entire state of Texas a kilometer deep, pumping poisonous gases into the atmosphere for thousands of years. For a long time, this was seen as an alternative theory for the extinction. But today, many scientists see the asteroid and the volcanoes as accomplices. The asteroid was the bullet, but the Deccan Traps may have been the poison that had already weakened the global ecosystem, making it more vulnerable to collapse. The immediate devastation of the impact, as horrific as it was only the beginning. The real killer was the aftermath. The trillions of tons of pulverized rock, soot from global wildfires, and sulfur compounds blasted into the atmosphere created a thick, impenetrable shroud that blocked out the sun. A deep, dark twilight fell over the entire planet, an impact winter that would last for years. Photosynthesis stopped. Plants withered and died. The entire food chain collapsed from the bottom up. The great herbivores, with nothing to eat, starved. And the giant carnivores that fed on them soon followed. This long, cold darkness was a filter, a great winnowing, and only the small, the adaptable and the lucky, would make it through. This is the heart of a great scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the dinosaurs were already in a slow, long-term decline due to the climate change from the volcanoes, or if they were thriving and at the peak of their diversity right up until that final catastrophic Tuesday. In one model, the asteroid was a final brutal blow to an already sick patient. In the other, it was a shocking, instantaneous assassination of a victim in perfect health. You are now in the long, drawn-out twilight of the impact winter. The sun is a ghost, a faint, smudged thumbprint behind a perpetual shroud of grey dust. A bitter, unnatural cold has gripped the planet, a chill that seeps into the very rock. The great noise of the Mesozoic world is gone. The thunder of giant footsteps, the chorus of strange calls, all of it has been replaced by an unnerving, profound silence, broken only by the whisper of a wind blowing ash across a dead and empty landscape. This is the great filter. The world has been reset to zero, and the rules for survival have been completely rewritten. Brute strength, massive size, fearsome teeth, these are no longer assets. They are a death sentence. In this new, dark world, size is the enemy. A triceratops needed hundreds of pounds of plants every single day. A T-Rex needed to eat a triceratops. With the sun gone and the plants dead, their fate was sealed within weeks. The giants simply starved. Survival in the impact winter was a game of inches, a contest for the small. To live, you had to be able to hide from the acid rain in a burrow or a hollow log. You had to have a metabolism that could idle on a thimbleful of fuel. You had to be able to make a meal out of the scraps and dregs of a ruined world. This is why our ancestors, the tiny, shrew-like mammals of the Cretaceous, made it through. And it's why a very specific type of dinosaur also survived. The food web had been obliterated. The new one was being built on a foundation of rot and decay. The survivors were the detritivores, the insects, worms, and fungi that fed on the endless supply of dead wood and decaying carcasses. And so, the animals that could eat the detritivores had a fighting chance. This was the world of the insect eater. The small, feathered theropods that had been scurrying in the undergrowth. The ones with generalized beaks that could peck for grubs in rotting logs or perhaps crack open the few seeds that lay dormant in the soil were now the heirs to the dinosaurian throne. Their insulated coats, first evolved to handle chilly winters, were now a critical piece of survival gear in a world plunged into a global deep freeze. This mainstream historical fact is the core of the extinction model. The impact winter, with its years of darkness and plummeting temperatures, was the primary kill mechanism, causing a total collapse of the photosynthetic food chain. And when the sunlight finally, weakly, began to pierce through the haze years later, what did it illuminate? Not the diverse forests of the Cretaceous. The scientific evidence from the fossil pollen record is stark and brutal. Directly on top of the iridium layer, there is a massive global spike in one thing: fern spores. The world was covered, from coast to coast, in a monotonous, opportunistic carpet of ferns. It was a disaster flora, the first wave of life to recolonize a sterilized planet. This fern-choked world was the new Eden, the first rung on a ladder back to complexity. Yet there were havens of a sort. As a quirky or fringe tidbit, while the land was barren and the surface of the oceans had been turned to acid, freshwater ecosystems like rivers and lakes fared slightly better. The constant flow of water and the chemical buffering from the surrounding soil and rock helped to neutralize the worst of the acid rain, allowing some of its inhabitants to cling to life. This is why crocodiles and alligators, turtles and some fish managed to survive the apocalypse, while their giant cousins in the sea, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, vanished completely. Crocodiles are just too stubborn to die, it seems, even when the world ends. The key to survival was being small, but paleontologists still argue whether the key advantage of being small was simply needing less food to survive the lean years, or if it was more about their live fast, die young lifestyle. Smaller animals tend to have much faster reproductive cycles and larger population sizes. A handful of rats can repopulate a continent in the time it would take for one elephant to even reach maturity. This reproductive speed may have been the true secret weapon, allowing their populations to bounce back more quickly from the very brink of annihilation. The age of giants was over, definitively and brutally. The stage was now empty, cleared for the small, the humble, and the feathered to inherit the earth. The dust is finally starting to settle, literally. Your journey now takes you across the threshold into a new world, the first chapter of a new book. The long, artificial winter is slowly receding as the particles in the atmosphere rain out, and a pale, watery sunlight touches the surface of the earth for the first time in generations. This new dawn illuminates a planet that is both empty and full of promise. The giants are gone, their ghosts haunting the silent fern prairies. The world is a blank slate, a wide-open field of opportunity for the small and the meek who have inherited the earth. This is the beginning of the Paleocene epoch, the first 10 million years of the Cenozoic era, our era. This new age is traditionally called the Age of Mammals, and it's true that our tiny, furry ancestors, having weathered the storm in their burrows, were perfectly poised to take over. They scurried out into the empty world and began a spectacular evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to bats, whales, elephants, and us. But to call it only the Age of Mammals is to ignore the other great survivor of the apocalypse. The dinosaurs were not entirely gone. One scrappy, feathered lineage made it through the filter. And they didn't just survive. they exploded. The Paleocene was just as much the age of birds. With their giant cousins erased from the board, the surviving birds found themselves in a world with no competition and thousands of empty jobs. And so they began to experiment, to diversify, to try on all the ecological hats their ancestors had left behind. The scientific evidence for this is etched into the fossil record. Immediately after the KP boundary, you see a phenomenon known as an adaptive radiation, a sudden rapid explosion of new species from a single common ancestor. The avian branch of the tree of life, which had been a modest little twig for millions of years, suddenly blossomed into a riot of new forms. They filled the forests, the shorelines, and the skies. And some of them, it seems, looked at the empty thrones of the great land predators and thought, why not? This brings us to a wonderfully bizarre and terrifying quirky or fringe tidbit: the rise of the terror birds. In South America, which was an isolated island continent at the time, a group of birds called the Forus racids gave up on flight altogether. They traded their wings for powerful running legs and evolved into the apex predators of their continent. Imagine a creature standing up to 3 meters tall, a flightless bird of prey with the disposition of a velociraptor, topped with a massive hatchet-like beak, powerful enough to crush bone or deliver a killing blow with a single brutal downward strike. For millions of years, these were the top carnivores, the T-Rexes of the New World. It was as if the dinosaurs, having been cheated out of their kingdom, sent their feathered descendants back to reclaim the land with a vengeance. This dramatic return to a terrestrial, predatory lifestyle is part of a larger scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the birds that survived the extinction were primarily ground dwellers or tree dwellers. One theory suggests that the global wildfires would have destroyed most of the forests, meaning that only ground-dwelling birds who could survive in the open, fern-choked landscape would have made it through. In this model, the terror birds are a prime example of this ground-up recovery. But another theory points out that the trees and their seeds would have offered a vital food source that wasn't dependent on photosynthesis, and that small perching birds would have been better equipped to exploit it. In this view, the survivors were the tiny forest dwellers, who then re-diversified, with some groups like the terror birds later re-evolving a ground-based existence. Whichever group formed the initial seed of the avian renaissance, the result was the same: a world where birds were not just the cheerful singers in the background. They were major players. They became giant herbivores, swift predators, and expert fishers, filling the roles that had been left vacant. The silent, ashen world of the impact winter was slowly being replaced by a new chorus of chirps, squawks, and, in some corners of the world, the thundering footsteps of a new kind of feathered tyrant. The dynasty wasn't over. It had just been reborn, leaner, meaner, and ready for a second act. Your journey now shifts focus from the dramatic, terrifying exceptions like the terror birds to the quieter, but ultimately far more successful, story unfolding in the trees, shorelines, and skies of this recovering world. While a few birds went back to the old dinosaurian business of being giant land predators, the vast majority took a different path. They doubled down on the very things that had allowed them to survive the apocalypse: small size, adaptability, and, above all, the power of flight. This was the true beginning of the avian dynasty as we know it today, a story written in the language of beaks, wings, and birdsong. As you watch the Paleocene world unfold, you see the survivors splitting into the two great groups that define all modern birds. This is a fundamental mainstream historical fact of ornithology. Every single one of the 10,000 plus bird species alive today belongs to one of two clans. The first is the Paleognathae, the old jaws. These are the ratites, the ostriches of Africa, the emus and cassowaries of Australia, the rheas of South America, and the kiwis of New Zealand. They are a fascinating group, almost all of whom independently gave up flight and grew large, once again stepping into the roles of terrestrial browsers and grazers. The other clan, the Neognathi or new jaws, is everybody else. From hummingbirds to eagles, from penguins to parrots, from sparrows to albatrosses, this single, sprawling, unbelievably diverse group accounts for over 99% of all living birds. They are the true winners of the post-dinosaur world. And as this great tree of life blossoms, you can still find, hidden in its branches, echoes of the deep past. Your journey takes you to the humid rainforests of the Amazon, where a strange, pheasant-sized bird is clambering clumsily through the branches. This is the Hoatzin, a truly bizarre creature, and a wonderful quirky or fringe tidbit for any story about evolution. It's sometimes called the stink bird because of its unique digestive system, which uses bacterial fermentation to break down leaves, giving it a manure-like odor. But the really amazing thing about the Hoatzin is its chicks. When they hatch, they have two prominent functional claws on the front of each wing. They use these little dinosaur hands to grip branches and climb through the trees long before they can fly. A perfect living echo of Archaeopteryx and Confucius ornis using their wing claws in the Mesozoic forests. It's a tangible, breathing link to a world lost 66 million years ago. How do we trace all these connections? How do we know when the hummingbirds split from the swifts, or when the first penguins decided to trade the sky for the sea? The fossil record is patchy, but in the last few decades, scientists have developed a new and incredibly powerful tool. This scientific evidence is called the molecular clock. The idea is simple but brilliant. When two species split from a common ancestor, their DNA begins to accumulate random mutations at a roughly constant, predictable rate. By comparing the DNA sequences of two living birds, say a chicken and an ostrich, and counting the number of differences, scientists can estimate how long it's been since they shared a common ancestor. It's like using genetic typos as a stopwatch to time the great branching points of evolution. This powerful tool, however, has created one of the biggest scholarly debates in modern paleontology. It's the Big Bang versus the slow fuse theory of bird evolution. The molecular clock data suggests that many of the major modern bird groups, the ancestors of ducks, chickens, parrots, and so on, began to diverge from each other before the asteroid hit, during the late Cretaceous. This is the slow fuse model. The diversification was a slow, steady process that started in the shadow of the dinosaurs. But the fossil record tells a different story. We find almost no fossils of these modern-looking birds in Cretaceous rocks. Instead, we see a massive, sudden explosion of them right after the extinction. This is the Big Bang model. The extinction event cleared the slate, triggering a rapid radiation of the few survivors. So, which is right? Was the diversification a slow burn that the fossils just haven't captured yet, or was it a sudden post-apocalyptic explosion? The answer is still being debated, a fascinating clash between the stories told by the rocks and the stories told by the genes. Whether it was a slow fuse or a big bang, the result was the same. The birds that emerged from the wreckage of the Cretaceous were a new and improved model. Your journey now takes you into the anatomy of these survivors, to look at the remarkable toolkit of adaptations that made them the undisputed masters of the air and allowed them to conquer every ecosystem on the planet. It was a complete overhaul, a re-engineering of the dinosaurian body plan for a new age. And the most important changes started with the face. The beak is the bird's Swiss Army knife. It is the single most versatile and adaptable tool in the animal kingdom. You have to remember what was lost. The theropod ancestors of birds had hands, three-fingered, clawed hands that they could use to grasp, rip, and manipulate their world. But in the long, slow evolution of the wing, these hands had to be sacrificed, folded into the flight surface. The beak evolved to become the new hand, a precision instrument mounted directly on the face, and once it appeared, evolution went wild with the design. You see beaks for every conceivable job: the short, stout, nut-cracking beak of a finch, the sharp, hooked, meat-tearing beak of an eagle, the long, delicate, nectar-sipping probe of a hummingbird, the bizarre, filter-feeding colander of a flamingo. This explosion of beak diversity was the key that unlocked 1 million new food sources. But a good multi-tool is useless without a high-performance engine to power it. The second great innovation was the perfection of the flight apparatus. The wings, bones, and muscles were refined for maximum efficiency and power. The skeleton became a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. As a quirky or fringe tidbit, many of the bones in a bird's skeleton are hollow and filled with air sacs, connected to their respiratory system. Furthermore, many bones are fused together for rigidity. The collarbones are fused to form the furcula, or wishbone, which acts like a spring during the flight stroke. The vertebrae of the hip are fused into a solid structure called a synsacrum, creating a stiff, stable platform to support the legs on landing. It is a body built for one primary purpose: to be as light and as strong as possible. This lightweight chassis was powered by an engine running on pure adrenaline. Birds have an incredibly high metabolism, a furnace that burns hot and fast to provide the immense energy needed for powered flight. Their respiratory system is a one-way loop of air sacs and passages, the most efficient on the planet, allowing them to extract oxygen from the air on both the inhale and the exhale. This is the biological equivalent of adding a turbocharger and a supercharger to the same engine. The scientific evidence for the power of this system comes from modern biomechanical studies. Using high-speed cameras and sophisticated computer models, scientists can analyze the aerodynamics of a bird's wing, revealing a level of control and efficiency that still inspires human aircraft designers. Of course, this modern bird didn't just appear overnight. As a mainstream historical fact, fossils from the late Cretaceous, like a seabird called Ichthyornis, show this transition happening in stages. Ichthyornis had a body that was almost completely modern, with a powerful keeled breastbone to anchor flight muscles. But when you opened its mouth, it was still full of sharp, reptilian teeth. It was a mosaic creature, part ancient dinosaur, part modern bird. A perfect snapshot of evolution in mid-stride. This incredible adaptability of the avian body plan, especially the beak, has led to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of beak diversity was purely specialization for different diets, or if other pressures, like their use in complex courtship rituals, nest building, and preening, were equally important in shaping their incredible variety. Was the toucan's giant, colorful bill an adaptation for eating fruit, or was it a billboard for attracting a mate? The answer is likely both, a beautiful example of how one tool can be shaped by a dozen different needs. The new world doesn't just look different, it sounds different. Your journey now is a journey of the senses, a shift from one soundscape to another. Imagine the soundtrack of the Mesozoic. We can only guess, of course, but we imagine a world of deep, guttural noises, the ground-shaking roars of tyrannosaurs, the bellowing calls of hadrosaurs, the hisses and growls of smaller predators. It would have been a percussive, powerful, and perhaps not very musical world. But now, as you stand in a Paleocene forest, a new sound begins to fill the air. It's a sound of incredible complexity and beauty, a symphony of whistles, trills, chirps, and clicks. It is the sound of birdsong, the new voice of the planet. This explosion of music was made possible by one of the most remarkable evolutionary innovations in the history of life. A brand new voice box. Dinosaurs, like modern crocodiles, almost certainly made noise using a larynx, the same structure at the top of the windpipe that we use to speak. It's a good, serviceable organ for making basic sounds, says Souls. But the ancestors of birds evolved something entirely new and far more sophisticated. It's called the syrinx. This is the scientific evidence that underpins the avian orchestra. The syrinx is a vocal organ located at the very bottom of the windpipe, where it splits to go to the two lungs. It has two separate sets of membranes and muscles, meaning a bird can produce two different notes at the exact same time. It can essentially sing a duet with itself, creating a rich, layered sound that is impossible for a larynx to produce. This incredible instrument is not just a recent invention. As a key mainstream historical fact, the oldest known fossilized syrinx was found in a bird called Vegavis aeaea, a relative of modern ducks and geese that lived in Antarctica during the last days of the Cretaceous. This tells us that some birds had already evolved the potential for complex vocalization before the asteroid impact, meaning the first true bird songs might have been sung to a dinosaur audience. But it was in the empty, quiet world after the extinction that this ability truly came into its own. In the silent dawn, the birds began to sing, and their songs were powerful tools for rebuilding their world. The primary purpose of this music was twofold: defending territory and attracting mates. A clear, strong song tells other males, "This patch of forest is mine, stay away." And it tells females, "I am healthy, strong, and hold a good territory. I would make a fine father for your chicks." But the story of birdsong goes far beyond these simple messages. It can be a tool of astonishing intelligence and deception. And for a truly mind-bending, quirky or fringe tidbit, you need only look to the superb lyrebird of Australia. This bird is the undisputed master of mimicry. It doesn't just sing its own song, it records and perfectly reproduces the sounds of its environment. It can flawlessly imitate the songs of dozens of other bird species, but it doesn't stop there. It can mimic the sound of a dog barking, a car alarm, the rhythmic clatter of a jackhammer, and most famously, the whine of a chainsaw and the click and whir of a camera's motor drive. This isn't just mimicry. It's a sophisticated act of vocal learning, a skill once thought to be unique to humans. This incredible cognitive ability feeds directly into a deep and fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether complex birdsong is simply a very elaborate, hard-wired instinct, a beautiful but mindless display, or if it represents something more. Is it a sign of genuine creativity, a form of animal culture, or even a primitive form of art? When a bowerbird decorates its nest with carefully chosen blue objects and performs a complex song and dance routine, is it just an automaton running its genetic program, or is it an artist trying to create something beautiful to impress a mate? The line between instinct and intelligence, between programming and artistry, is incredibly blurry, and birds challenge our human-centric assumptions about where that line should be drawn. The story of the feathered dragons is almost complete. You've followed their journey from the ground to the air, from a world of silence to a world of song. You've seen their bodies transform, their faces remade, their voices reinvented. But there is one final, crucial piece of the puzzle. The invisible engine behind all of this success. The evolution of the brain. For decades, the phrase bird brain has been a common insult, a shorthand for stupidity. Your journey now takes you inside the skull of these creatures to reveal just how profoundly and spectacularly wrong that insult is. The spark of this intelligence wasn't a recent development. It was another legacy inherited from their deep dinosaur past. As you travel back to the Cretaceous, you find that the theropods on the path to birds were already outliers. A mainstream historical fact is that dinosaurs like the dromaeosaurs, and especially a group called the troodontids, had unusually large brains for their body size. Paleontologists measure this using a ratio called the encephalization quotient, or EQ. While a giant sauropod had a tiny brain for its massive body, a dinosaur like Troodon had a brain proportionally similar to that of a modern flightless bird, suggesting it was already a highly capable and intelligent predator. But what does that intelligence look like? The answer lies in the very structure of the brain itself. For a long time, scientists believed the avian brain was primitive, lacking a developed neocortex, the wrinkled outer layer of the mammalian brain that we associate with higher thought. This led to the assumption that they were creatures of simple instinct. But modern neuroscience has revealed the truth. This is the scientific evidence. A bird's brain isn't primitive, it's just organized differently. The seat of its intelligence is a structure called the pallium, and while it's smooth, not wrinkled, it is packed with neurons at a density that is off the charts. A macaw's brain is the size of a walnut, but it has more neurons in its forebrain than a macaque monkey with a brain the size of a lemon. It is a small, sleek, incredibly powerful supercomputer. And what can this supercomputer do? For a stunning quirky or fringe tidbit, consider the case of a New Caledonian crow named Betty. In a laboratory at Oxford University, Betty was presented with a problem. A small bucket of food was at the bottom of a tall plastic tube just out of reach of her beak. The scientists had provided a straight piece of wire. Without any training, Betty took the wire, braced it against the tube, and used her beak to bend the end of it into a perfect hook. She then used this newly manufactured tool to lift the bucket out of the tube. This wasn't just tool use, it was spontaneous tool manufacturing, an act that demonstrates a clear understanding of cause and effect, physical properties, and, most importantly, foresight, the ability to see a problem and create a solution in your mind's eye. This incredible cognitive horsepower didn't just appear out of nowhere, it raises a fascinating scholarly debate that takes us back to their ancestors. Historians still argue whether the enlarged brains of dinosaurs like Troodon evolved for one primary purpose or several. Was this increased brain power a requirement for processing the complex sensory information needed to be an agile, fast-moving predator with keen binocular vision? Or was it driven by the need for complex social behavior, for pack hunting and communication? Or perhaps was a larger, faster brain a necessary prerequisite for the most computationally demanding activity of all? Flight? Mastering the three-dimensional world of the air, with its wind currents and split-second decisions, requires a processor of immense speed and power. It's possible that the bird brain wasn't a consequence of flight, but one of the essential ingredients that made flight possible in the first place. Your journey has taken you deep inside the bird's mind, revealing a supercomputer born from a dinosaur's needs. Now you pull your focus back to the surface, to look again at the one feature that started this entire story. The feather. You've seen its humble beginnings as a simple fuzz for warmth, its transformation into a billboard for courtship, and its final perfection as a tool for flight. But the modern feather is so much more than that. It is the single most complex and versatile structure ever produced by the skin of any animal, a masterpiece of biological engineering that clothes the planet in a living, breathing coat of dinosaurs. Let's look at one closely. A single flight feather from the wing of an eagle. It seems simple, but it's a miracle of design. The central shaft, or rachis, is both incredibly strong and shockingly light. Branching off from it are hundreds of parallel barbs, but the magic happens when you zoom in further. Each of those barbs has hundreds more, even smaller filaments branching off, called barbules. And these barbules are equipped with tiny microscopic hooks called barbicels. This is the scientific evidence revealed by the electron microscope. The hooks on one barbule catch and interlock with the smooth barbules of its neighbor, creating a seamless, flexible, and surprisingly strong surface. It's a system of millions of microscopic Velcro fasteners. When the feather gets ruffled, a bird can simply run its beak through it, and like a zipper, the hooks re-engage, making the vein smooth and perfect again. This intricate structure is built from a very ancient substance. A key mainstream historical fact is that feathers are made of beta-keratin, a tough, fibrous protein. This is the very same protein that makes up the scales of a modern lizard or crocodile. It is a direct biochemical link to their reptilian ancestry. The birds didn't invent a new material for their coat. They simply found a revolutionary new way to assemble the old one, transforming a simple plate of armor into a soft, complex three-dimensional tool. And they use that tool for everything. A feather's job isn't over when the bird lands. It is a waterproof raincoat, thanks to oils from a preen gland that birds meticulously spread over their entire body. The interlocking barbs create a tight seal that keeps the skin dry even in a downpour. It is a high-performance thermal layer. The downy feathers close to the skin trap a layer of air, creating a personal sleeping bag of insulation that is so effective, we humans still haven't invented a synthetic material that can beat its warmth-to-weight ratio. And of course, it is a canvas for communication, painted with pigments and structured to create shimmering, iridescent colors that signal health, status, and identity. This incredible coat requires constant maintenance, and it's a huge investment of energy. As a quirky or fringe tidbit, the number of feathers on a single bird is astonishing. A tiny songbird might have 2,000 to 3,000, but a large tundra swan can be covered in over 25,000 individual feathers, with the vast majority of them being tiny, insulating feathers on its head and neck. Once a year, this entire coat is discarded and regrown in a process called molting, a vulnerable time when the bird must generate thousands of new, perfect structures from scratch. This entire complex system, the Velcro-like structure, the keratin building block, the multifunctionality, all traces its ancestry back to a simple, hair-like filament on a dinosaur in a chilly Cretaceous forest. But the very beginning of that story is still a mystery, the subject of a deep, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the very first proto-feathers evolved from reptilian scales that became elongated and then frayed apart, or if they arose from a completely new, tube-like structure, a follicle that grew out of the skin independently. Was it a scale that learned to be a feather, or a brand new idea entirely? The answer is still buried deep in the Triassic, waiting to be unearthed. You have seen the feather perfected, a tool of 1,000 uses. Now your long journey through deep time finally brings you home, back to the present day, to a world built by human hands, but still shared with the dinosaurs. For millions of years, our mammalian ancestors were the understudies, the little creatures scurrying in the shadows of the great reptiles. But now, the roles are reversed. We are the giants, and the feathered dragons have adapted to live in our world. And in doing so, they have become the most successful and ubiquitous wild animals we encounter in our daily lives, a constant, living reminder of the planet's deep and violent history. And our relationship with them is ancient and profound. Of all the billions of birds on Earth, our most intimate connection is with one particular species. You've almost certainly eaten one in the last week. The humble chicken. This is not a metaphor, it is a direct biological reality. The chicken clucking in a farmyard is a theropod dinosaur, a direct descendant of the same lineage that produced Velociraptor and Tyrannosaurus rex. In fact, a quirky or fringe tidbit that never ceases to be amazing is that when scientists managed to extract fragments of collagen protein from a 68-million-year-old T-Rex bone, they compared its molecular structure to modern animals. The closest match was not a lizard or a crocodile. It was a chicken. The king of the tyrant lizards is, in a very real sense, family to the king of the barnyard. This relationship began thousands of years ago. As a mainstream historical fact, the domestication of the chicken is now believed to have begun in Southeast Asia around 3,500 years ago, from a wild ancestor called the red jungle fowl. Early rice farming created a new, reliable food source, attracting these forest birds to human settlements. And from there, they spread across the globe with human migration, becoming the single most numerous bird species on the planet. We didn't just conquer the world, we brought our favorite dinosaurs with us. But our relationship hasn't always been one of peaceful coexistence. Sometimes it's been one of outright and frankly embarrassing conflict. For a perfect example, you have to travel to Australia in 1932. After World War I, the Australian government settled many veterans in Western Australia to become wheat farmers. The only problem was that their new farms were on the annual migration route of 20,000 emu. The giant, flightless birds, basically 6-foot-tall retites, saw the new farms as an all-you-can-eat buffet. The situation became so dire that the farmers, many of them ex-soldiers, petitioned the government for military aid. And the government agreed. This led to the Great Emu War, where the Australian military, armed with 2 Lewis machine guns, officially declared war on the emu population. The result was a total humiliation for the humans. The emus proved to be masters of guerrilla tactics, splitting into small groups and running in unpredictable patterns, making them almost impossible targets. After a month of frustration and thousands of rounds of ammunition spent for very few kills, the military withdrew in defeat. The emus had won. This story is more than just a funny anecdote. It's a reminder of the resilience and adaptability of these creatures. And it's that same masterful design that has inspired our own attempts to conquer the air. The scientific evidence for this is found in the field of biomimicry. The next time you see a large bird like an eagle or a hawk coming in to land, watch its wings. It doesn't just hold them stiff, it constantly adjusts them. It separates the feathers at its wingtips to reduce turbulence, changes the wing's curvature, and twists its shape to maintain stability at low speeds. This morphing wing is a marvel of natural engineering, and for decades, human aircraft designers have been trying to copy it. Today, this inspiration is a core component in the design of advanced drones and next-generation fighter jets, which use flexible materials and complex internal structures to mimic a bird's ability to change its wing shape on the fly. We are still taking engineering lessons from the dinosaurs. This deep, instinctual connection we have with them, from food to warfare to technology, also echoes in our oldest stories, leading to a profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the universal presence of powerful bird figures in human mythology, the thunderbird of Native American lore, the fiery phoenix of ancient Egypt, the giant roc of Arabian Nights, is just a simple reflection of the awe we feel watching an eagle soar, or if it taps into something much deeper, a fundamental, archetypal human longing for the freedom of the skies that these creatures so effortlessly embody. This brings your journey to a new and final frontier, not a place in the past, but a place in the present, a laboratory where the tools are no longer just hammers, chisels, and brushes. The modern paleontologist's toolkit now includes particle accelerators, medical scanners, and supercomputers. The story of the feathered dragons is no longer just a story we dig from the ground. It's a story we are decoding, one pixel at a time, from inside the stone itself. We are now looking at these ancient creatures with a new kind of sight. For over 150 years, the only way to see what was inside a fossil was to destroy it. To understand the brain of a dinosaur, you had to cut its skull in half, a prospect that would make any museum curator break out in a cold sweat. But that has all changed. The mainstream historical fact is that the widespread adoption of medical imaging technology, particularly computed tomography or CT scanning, has completely revolutionized the field. A technology designed to look inside a living human head without harm is now the most powerful tool we have for looking into petrified one. Here is the scientific evidence and how it works. A paleontologist takes a priceless, irreplaceable dinosaur skull and places it inside the CT scanner. The machine then rotates around the fossil, bombarding it with a series of finely controlled X-ray beams, taking thousands of digital slice images. A powerful computer then stacks these thousands of 2D cross-sections on top of each other, creating a perfect, high-resolution, three-dimensional digital model of the fossil, inside and out. It's a form of digital dissection. Scientists can now fly through the brain case, trace the delicate paths of nerves and blood vessels, and examine the structure of the inner ear, all without ever laying a scalpel on the specimen. What does this tell us? It tells us about the senses of these lost animals. By digitally filling in the brain cavity of a T-Rex, we can see that it had absolutely enormous olfactory bulbs, the part of the brain that processes smell. This confirms it had a sense of smell that was, at the very least, as good as a modern vulture's, allowing it to track prey or find carcasses from miles away. By examining the shape of the inner ear canals, we can make educated guesses about their sense of balance, their agility, and even the typical posture in which they held their heads. And sometimes, this new sight reveals things that seem truly impossible. As a fantastically quirky or fringe tidbit, a technique even more powerful than CT scanning, called synchrotron scanning, uses X-rays 1,000,000 times brighter than the sun to map the actual chemical composition of a fossil. In the UK, scientists used this method on a small, unassuming brown pebble found on a beach. It turned out to be the fossilized brain of a 133-million-year-old dinosaur, an iguanodontian. The synchrotron was able to detect the chemical ghosts of the brain's outer membranes and the tiny collagen blood vessels within. For the first time, we weren't just looking at the shape of the container. We were seeing the faint, mineralized traces of what was once inside. This ability to see the unseen, to find the whispers of soft tissue and the architecture of the brain, naturally pushes our imaginations to the ultimate science fiction question. If we can learn this much, could we bring them back? This is the heart of a very modern and very real scholarly debate. Paleontologists still argue whether, even if we could clear the monumental technical hurdles, we should. The first problem is the data itself. DNA is a fragile molecule that breaks down relatively quickly. Even in perfect conditions, it's unlikely to survive much longer than 1 million years. The 66-million-year gap is almost certainly too vast to ever find a complete genome. But for the sake of argument, what if we could? Do we have the right to resurrect an animal into an atmosphere with different oxygen levels, a world with plants and diseases it has no immunity to, a climate it isn't built for? Would it be a magnificent scientific achievement, or an act of profound, unparalleled cruelty? It is the ultimate Jurassic Park dilemma, and a question that is no longer confined to the pages of a novel. This new, almost magical sight, the ability to digitally dissect a creature frozen in stone for 100 million years, brings your journey full circle. You started with the classic image of the dinosaur, a monster built from a few giant bones and a lot of human imagination. Now you end with a creature revealed in its most intimate detail, from the passages of its inner ear to the ghostly traces of its brain tissue. But this story isn't just about the fossils, and it's not just about the technology. At its heart, it has always been a story about us. It's a story about human curiosity, about the deep, innate need to look at the past and understand our place in the grand, violent, beautiful story of life on this planet. Paleontology is, and has always been, a profoundly human science. And as a mainstream historical fact, it remains one of the very few scientific fields where amateurs, armed with nothing more than a keen eye and a bit of luck, can still make discoveries that change everything. So many of the most important fossils in history were not found by university professors on grand, funded expeditions. They were found by farmers plowing their fields, by hikers who noticed a strange shape in a rock, by children with a passion for collecting dragon bones. And for a truly foundational, quirky, or fringe tidbit that speaks to the soul of this field, you must travel back to the early 19th century, to the seaside cliffs of Lyme Regis in England. Here, a young woman named Mary Anning, born into a poor family and with no formal education, taught herself geology and anatomy. She had an almost supernatural talent for seeing the fossils hidden in the crumbling shale cliffs. It was Mary Anning who found the first complete skeleton of an ichthyosaur, the first plesiosaur, and the first pterosaur found outside of Germany. She made some of the most important discoveries in the history of paleontology, discoveries that helped shape our very understanding of extinction and deep time. Yet, because she was a woman and from a low social class, she was often denied entry to the scientific societies of the day and was rarely given full credit for her work in the scientific papers that described her finds. Her spirit of passionate, dedicated discovery lives on today, amplified by tools she could never have dreamed of. The modern fossil hunter's map is no longer just drawn on paper. It's created from space. This is the scientific evidence. A technology called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, is changing how we find dig sites. A plane or a drone flies over a target area, say a dense jungle in South America, and fires down millions of laser pulses. By measuring the time it takes for these pulses to bounce back, a computer can digitally strip away all the vegetation, creating a hyper-accurate 3D map of the bare earth beneath. This allows paleontologists to see the subtle bumps and ridges of the underlying rock formations, helping them spot promising new areas to explore without having to spend months blindly cutting through the jungle. This combination of more eyes on the ground and better tools to guide them has led to what many are calling a new golden age of dinosaur discovery. We have named more new dinosaur species in the last 20 years than in the entire 150 years that came before. This incredible boom is the subject of a lively scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this explosion of new names is primarily due to simply having more paleontologists working in more places around the world, opening up vast new fossil beds in places like China, Argentina, and Africa. Or is it driven by the new technologies, like CT scanning, that allow us to re-examine old fossils that have been sitting in museum drawers for a century and realize they are actually unique, new species? Or is it a combination of all of the above? Whatever the cause, the result is clear. The book of the dinosaurs is still being written, and new chapters are being added every single year. So where does this long, winding journey leave you? You've traveled from the printing stones of Bavaria to the volcanic ash of China, from the barren plains of Siberia to the asteroid's ground zero in the Gulf of Mexico. You've witnessed the birth of the feather, the dawn of flight, and the violent, fiery end of a world. You've seen how science can take a few scattered bones and a bit of dust and reconstruct not just a skeleton, but a creature's color, its climate, and the echoes of its voice. And after all that, you might be tempted to see this as just a story about them. A fantastic, dramatic tale about the rise and fall and improbable rebirth of the dinosaurs. But the final, most profound twist in this story is that it has never been just about them. It has always been a story about you. Every fossil dug from the ground, every new insight gleaned from a CT scanner is a mirror. It reflects our own place in the grand, chaotic, and unimaginably long story of life. The discovery of the feathered dragons didn't just change our picture of the past. It fundamentally changed our understanding of time itself. It forces you to confront the concept of deep time, a term first championed in the 18th century by the Scottish geologist James Hutton, a mainstream historical fact that shattered the human-centric timescale of the world. He realized that for geological processes like erosion and mountain building to occur, the Earth couldn't be a few thousand years old. It had to be ancient beyond all human reckoning. The dinosaurs are the ultimate poster children for this concept. Their reign lasted for 165 million years. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has been around for about 300,000. That means the dinosaurs ruled the world for a period of time 550 times longer than we have even existed. The last Stegosaurus had been dead for 80 million years before the first T-Rex ever walked the Earth. That's a time gap twice as long as the one that separates T-Rex from you. This vastness is humbling. It dismantles the old idea of evolution as a purposeful ladder, with humanity as its final crowning achievement. Instead, you see it for what it is: a wild, unpredictable branching bush where survival is often just a matter of dumb luck. The asteroid didn't care that the dinosaurs were magnificent and successful. A random cosmic event hit the reset button, and our tiny, shivering mammalian ancestors just happened to be standing in the right place to inherit the ruins. And the genetic legacy of that ancient world is still inside us all. The scientific evidence for this lies in a set of master control genes called homeobox, or HOX genes. These are the ancient genes that lay out the basic body plan of an animal. Head here, tail here, limbs here. They are so fundamental that they are shared, with minor variations, across almost the entire animal kingdom. The same genes that told a T-Rex embryo where to sprout its legs are still at work telling a human embryo where to put its own. The code is ancient, which brings us to a wonderfully strange and slightly unsettling quirky or fringe tidbit: the Dino Chicken Project. Scientists like the paleontologist Jack Horner are not trying to clone a dinosaur from ancient DNA. Instead, they are working with chicken embryos and trying to figure out how to turn off the more recent genetic switches that suppress their ancestral traits. They have already managed to grow chicken embryos with a dinosaur-like snout instead of a beak, and have identified the genes that fuse the tail vertebrae. Their goal is to hatch a chicken with teeth, a long tail, and hands, a living dinosaur, created not by adding new genes, but by reactivating the old ones that are still sleeping in its DNA. This incredible, almost godlike ability we now have to both read and rewrite the story of life is the subject of a final, deep, scholarly debate. Philosophers of science still argue whether our success in uncovering the deep past is a magnificent testament to the power of human reason and the scientific method, proving that no mystery is ultimately beyond our grasp. Or is it the opposite? Is it a humbling lesson in humility? A reminder that for every fossil we find, trillions more have been lost forever? That every beautiful theory we build is based on a tiny, incomplete sliver of evidence, and that our knowledge is, and always will be, just a provisional, fleeting interpretation of an impossibly vast and largely unknowable history? The feathered dragon in the mirror looks back at you, and the question hangs in the air. And so, the story that began with a single, impossible fossil on a slab of German limestone has brought you to this moment. The great mystery of the feathered dragons, the question of where birds came from, is solved. They are not the distant, polite cousins of the dinosaurs. They are the dinosaurs themselves, the last surviving branch of a mighty and ancient dynasty, a lineage that has weathered mass extinctions, reshaped its body and mind, and learned to thrive in a world that its ancestors could never have imagined. The journey through deep time is over. The final part of the journey is simply to open your eyes and see the world around you in a new light. The next time you are woken in the morning by the sound of bird song outside your window, stop for a moment and listen. That is not just a bird. That is a time capsule. That tiny feathered creature, whether it's a common sparrow, a city pigeon, or a bold robin, is a living, breathing theropod. Its hollow bones, its high-speed metabolism, its complex brain, and its magnificent coat of feathers are all a direct inheritance from a world that vanished in a flash of light 66 million years ago. Every flit of its wings is an echo of a raptor's predatory strike. Every note of its song is powered by a voice box that first evolved in the twilight of the Cretaceous. Their success is staggering. As a mainstream historical fact, depending on how you classify them, there are between 10,000 and 18,000 distinct species of birds alive today. This makes them by far the most diverse and successful class of tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates on the planet. They have conquered every continent and every ocean, from the frozen deserts of Antarctica to the steaming jungles of the Amazon, from the highest peaks of the Himalayas to the concrete canyons of our own cities. This is not a group in decline. This is a dynasty at the absolute peak of its power. The scientific evidence for their identity is now unambiguous. The modern method of classifying life is called cladistics, which groups organisms based on shared evolutionary novelties. On the great family tree of life, the branch labeled aves, birds, is nested deeply within the larger branch of Dinosauria, which itself is part of the larger branch of Archaeopteryx. They are not like dinosaurs. They officially are dinosaurs, just as we are officially mammals and apes. And their story is not over. Evolution did not stop when humans arrived. In fact, our presence is now the single greatest driver of their ongoing evolution. As a fascinating, quirky, or fringe tidbit, we can see them adapting to our world in real time. In Japan, carrion crows have learned to take hard-shelled nuts, place them in the road at intersections, and wait for the cars to run them over and crack them. They have even been observed waiting for the pedestrian crossing light to change before safely retrieving their snack. In our cities, many songbirds are now singing at a higher pitch and a faster tempo than their country cousins, a direct adaptation to make their songs audible above the low-frequency roar of urban traffic. This is evolution in action, a new chapter being written in our own backyards. This new intertwined destiny, where their future is now inextricably linked to ours, is the subject of the final, most pressing scholarly debate. Ecologists still argue whether the Anthropocene, the age of humans, will be a catalyst for a new, rapid wave of avian evolution, creating hyper-intelligent, specialized city birds that thrive in our man-made ecosystems. Or will our relentless expansion, the destruction of habitats, and the warming of the climate prove to be the one challenge that this ancient dynasty cannot overcome? Will the story of the feathered dragons, a story of 220 million years of survival and innovation, finally end with us? The chirps and calls from beyond the glass are no longer just background noise. They are a question. So you have followed this story from its beginning to its end, and from its end to its new beginning. The journey has taken you from the scaly monsters of Victorian paintings to the vibrant, feathered, and astonishingly complex creatures revealed by the light of modern science. You've recapped the grand journey from the first challenge of Archaeopteryx to the feathered backyard dinosaurs of today. The story is a vast, sprawling epic, a testament to both the brutal indifference of the cosmos and the stubborn, relentless creativity of life. And the final step is to trace that unbroken line of descent directly to your own world. The theropod dinosaurs did not all die out. That is the single most important revelation of this entire story. When that mountain of rock struck the earth and the long night fell, most of the great dinosaurian lineages vanished forever. But one small group, already equipped with the perfect toolkit for surviving an apocalypse, weathered the storm. The mainstream historical fact is that the Cretaceous Paleogene, KPG, extinction event, caused by that massive asteroid impact 66 million years ago, was a planetary filter. It wiped out about 75% of all species on Earth, a devastating purge that included every single dinosaur that we would call non-avian. So why did the ancestors of modern birds survive when their giant cousins perished? The answer is a perfect storm of advantages. They were small, which meant their food requirements were tiny. In a starving world, this was the ultimate superpower. They could fly, which meant they were not tied to a single devastated location. They could travel immense distances to find pockets of surviving resources, and their diet was likely generalized. While the great herbivores starved for lack of plants, and the great carnivores starved for lack of herbivores, the early birds could likely make a meal of the things that did survive: the dormant seeds buried in the soil, and the insects and worms that fed on the endless buffet of decaying matter. They survived on the crumbs of a ruined world. The scientific evidence for their triumphant recovery is undeniable. In the millions of years immediately following the KPG extinction, the fossil record shows an explosive diversification of bird species. It's as if a dam broke. With their competitors gone, they flooded into every empty ecological niche, becoming the new predators, the new shore dwellers, and the new masters of the forest canopy. They inherited the earth. And if you ever doubt the truth of this inheritance, you need only look to the most common dinosaur on the planet today: the chicken. This isn't just a fun comparison, it's a matter of molecular fact. The quirky or fringe tidbit that seals this connection comes from a fragment of 68-million-year-old T-Rex bone, from which scientists were miraculously able to extract tiny scraps of collagen protein. When they analyzed its molecular sequence, they found it shared a closer evolutionary relationship with modern chickens and ostriches than with any living reptile. The tyrant king and the barnyard fowl are family. This single fact should change the way you see the world. That pigeon strutting on the sidewalk, that sparrow flitting in a bush, that chicken on your plate, they are not just descended from dinosaurs in some abstract, distant way. They are dinosaurs. They are the last living representatives of a dynasty that ruled this planet for 165 million years, carrying a legacy of survival in their very bones. The exact mechanisms of their cousin's demise are still the subject of a scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the primary kill mechanism of the asteroid was the initial heat blast, the crushing tsunamis, the years of global winter that starved the world, or the acid rain that poisoned the oceans. It was likely a horrific combination of all of them, a planetary multi-pronged attack that only the small, the mobile, and the feathered were equipped to endure. And so we arrive at the end of our long story. It is a story of scientific discovery, a perfect example of how one clue after another, a feather here, a pigment cell there, a strange bone from a frozen steppe, can methodically topple old certainties and reveal a world more complex, more vibrant, and far more wonderful than we ever dared to imagine. The story of the feathered dragons is not truly a story about the past. It's a story about the present. It's about how we know what we know, and the humility to accept that tomorrow, a farmer in a distant field might unearth a single fossil that forces us to begin the story all over again. Because this story is not finished, it is being written, right now, by paleontologists working in the heat of the Argentinian desert and the cold winds of the Gobi. New fossils are being pulled from the earth every year, each one adding a new sentence, a new paragraph, or sometimes a completely new chapter to our understanding of this dynasty. The success of their lineage is written across the face of the modern world. As a mainstream historical fact, there are currently over 10,000 known species of modern birds, making them one of the most successful and diverse groups of vertebrate animals on the entire planet. Their kingdom never truly fell. It just became lighter, faster, and learned to sing. Think of that transformation. The great ground-shaking roars we imagine for the giant dinosaurs, sounds that were likely deep, percussive, and powerful, have been refined over millions of years into the intricate bird song we hear today. The soundtrack of the planet has changed from the roar to the chirp, and we know this transition is ancient. The scientific evidence for this comes from a fossil of an Antarctic bird called Vegavis, which lived alongside the last dinosaurs. Preserved in its chest was the oldest known syrinx, the unique avian voice box. The ancestors of modern birds were already singing their complex songs while T-Rex still walked the earth. It is a wonderful quirky or fringe tidbit that in many cultures the idea of a feathered, dragon-like creature has existed for centuries. In China, the very word for dinosaur is konglong, which means terrible dragon. For generations, the dragon bones sold by farmers, which we now know were dinosaur fossils, fueled the mythology of great serpentine beasts. It's a fascinating case of myth accidentally stumbling upon a deep scientific truth long before the science ever existed. The feathered dragons were real, after all. And so, we are left looking towards the horizon of discovery. What great mysteries are still waiting to be solved? Will we one day find the fossil of that first Triassic ancestor, the creature that gave feathers to all its descendants? Will we perfect the technology to map the lost, brilliant colors of more species, to truly paint a full portrait of this lost world? The mystery isn't solved. It has just become deeper, more profound, and infinitely more beautiful. And with that final thought, let the journey gently come to an end. The images of the ancient world, of the fern-choked forests and the dusty Cretaceous plains, can begin to soften now, fading like a watercolor painting left out in a soft rain. The vibrant colors of the feathered creatures, the flash of a russet tail and the shimmer of an iridescent wing, can all dissolve back into the quiet darkness behind your eyes. There are no more startling discoveries to be made tonight, no more asteroids to fall, no more worlds to end or begin. The great deep quiet of geological time has settled over everything, a silence as profound and as peaceful as the one that is now beginning to envelop you. All the noise and the drama of that lost world can recede, leaving only the gentle, steady rhythm of your own breathing and the soft, heavy comfort of your bed. The great story is over, and now it is time for the deep, dreamless and well-earned sleep that follows a long adventure. The dragons are all resting now, and it is time for you to rest with them.